Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the soot-streaked, flour-dusted world of a Victorian bakehouse. You might think being surrounded by warm, crusty bread sounds kind of cosy, maybe even romantic. But let's cut the sugarcoating right now. It sucked to be a baker in Victorian England. You're about to find out why, and spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, tell me your city and what time it is where you are right now. I always love seeing who else is awake at this unholy hour. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to total darkness. Not peaceful, dream-filled darkness, but the thick, gritty kind, like someone threw a sack over your head while you were sleeping. It's 2 a.m, and the city is dead quiet. Except for the rats in the alley, of course, and the occasional horse clopping past with a drunken constable slouched on top. But inside your cramped attic room, there's only the sharp pang of your bones waking up far too early. You swing your legs over the side of the straw mattress and wince. Every toe screams. Your knees feel like they've rusted overnight. You reach for your boots, still crusted with flour from yesterday. Or was it the day before? Time kind of blurs when you haven't had a full night's sleep since the Queen was young. As you fumble down the steep, groaning stairs of the bakehouse, you smell it already. Coal smoke, yeast, and the sour ghost of yesterday's loaves. The oven's been burning low all night, and now it's your job to wake it up. You stoke it carefully, squinting through the thickening haze of smoke that curls up and makes your eyes itch like hell. There's no ventilation, just soot-coated walls and a couple of mice who think they live here rent-free. Most people don't realise this, but baking in the 1800s wasn't some wholesome act of love. It was war. A war against time, fire, sleep deprivation, and the terrifying possibility that your loaves might not rise, and if they don't, neither do your wages. You start your day when most people are still drooling into their pillows, and you keep working until well after the sun has gone down, sometimes pushing 20 hours straight. And don't get the idea you're alone in this misery. The baker's assistant, usually a grim, soot-faced teenager who's been sleeping beside the flour sacks, is already dragging buckets of water from the alley pump. He grumbles something that might be a greeting, or possibly a curse, and starts hauling sacks of flour that each weigh more than he does. There's no coffee, no breakfast, just work. You begin mixing dough in a wooden trough the size of a coffin, arms plunged elbow deep in the sticky mess. Back curved like a shrimp. Every pull and fold is a workout. Victorian flour is coarse and the yeast unreliable. No commercial packets to save you. You have to coax the bubbles into life with the right temperature, a sprinkle of sugar and blind hope. Oh, and you're doing this by candlelight. Maybe a gas lamp, if you're working in a modern shop. But it's mostly shadows and smoke, which means one bad reach and you're plunging your hand into scalding water or slicing your palm on a jagged tin mould. But the clock's ticking. You need to mix, rise, shape, proof and bake dozens, if not hundreds of loaves before the first customer waddles in at dawn demanding her daily half-quartern of white. And that brings us to your first historical breadcrumb, the quartern loaf. It's the standard Victorian measure of bread, weighing around 4 pounds and made with a mix of white and brown flours. Poorer customers would buy a half or even a quarter. Bread wasn't just food, it was currency. If your loaf was light, you'd hear about it from everyone, especially the inspector. And guess what? That same inspector doesn't care how little sleep you've had, or that you're half blind from flour dust. He'll show up with a ruler and a smug little notebook ready to weigh your loaves to the ounce. Too light? That's a fine. Too heavy? You just lost profit. One customer accuses you of skimming, and suddenly you're facing a tribunal like you baked arsenic into the Queen's toast. But hey, here's a weird little fringe fact to sprinkle on top of your misery like stale poppy seeds. Some Victorian bakers did work naked. Yep, when the heat got unbearable, and it did, they'd strip down to the buff, especially at night, to keep from passing out. Makes you wonder how sanitary those hand-shaped loaves really were. There's some debate, though, among culinary historians about just how widespread this practice was. Some argue it's a myth exaggerated by reformers trying to improve working conditions. Others point to first-hand accounts of apprentices being fined for indecency in the bakehouse. Either way, it's not exactly the Great British Bake Off, is it? By the time daylight finally slips in through the soot-smudged window, you're already deep into the second bake. First wave of loaves is cooling on wooden racks that warp with the moisture. and your second batch is proofing under a stiff sheet that smells like warm beer. You haven't sat down, you haven't eaten, your knuckles are cracked, and customers are starting to bang on the door. Congratulations, you've survived the first 4 hours, just 14 more to go. You push open the bakehouse door just enough to peer into the greyish morning. The sky looks like wet laundry, and the street is still hushed, slick with last night's rain, and maybe something less savoury from the horses, but you can already see her, Widow Pratchett, first in line as always, cheeks like wrinkled apples and voice like a hacksaw. She wants her loaf precisely, not too dark, not too airy, and cut, if you please, not torn like last week's disgrace. You don't remember last week. You barely remember your own name before 9 a.m. Inside the shop front, it's a world apart from the bakehouse. The tiny counter has a dusty display with a few loaves you sacrificed for appearance's sake. Overbaked, symmetrical, perfect crust. Behind it, a chalkboard listing prices that haven't changed in 5 years, even though flour just went up again last week. The customers trickle in, one by one and then two by two, until they're practically shoulder to shoulder, elbowing for their morning bread like it's the second coming. But you're already back in the dungeon. Let's call it what it is, a dungeon. No windows, a ceiling so low you bang your head every time you stand up too fast, and walls that permanently look damp. The soot from the coal oven smears everything. It's under your nails, in your ears, and definitely in your lungs. You once sneezed out what looks suspiciously like a chimney flake. The walls are black, not painted, just time and smoke grinding into every brick. You tried whitewashing once, but the oven laughed and peeled it off in 3 days. Your oven, by the way, is a hand-built beast. Brick-lined, coal-fired, hot enough to warp reality if you get too close. It dominates the room, crouched like a monster in the corner, its iron door screaming on its hinges when you open it. To feed it, you have to reach into the mouth of hell with a long wooden peel and slide in the dough with the grace of a medieval fencer. One slip and your arms blistered to the elbow. Which happened twice. And here's where things get dangerously Victorian. The floor. It's always damp. Some say it's condensation. Others think it's something seeping up from the foundations. Either way, it's a slip hazard. A mould party and a breeding ground for who knows what. You spread sawdust down, the old-fashioned way to prevent slips and soak up the grossness. But it mixes with the flour on the ground and becomes something like a glue trap from Satan's workshop. You might be thinking, well, at least you're not out in the cold. True, you're in 110-degree heat with coal smoke burning your throat and sweat soaking your shirt until it stiffens. You sometimes hallucinate little faces in the oven bricks. One time you were so dehydrated you tried to drink the yeast starter. It was not a good idea. Now here's your historical fact to knead into this doughy misery. The average Victorian bakehouse could reach internal temperatures of 120 49 degrees during a long day of baking. Ventilation was a joke. Some shops had a little flues near the ceiling, but more often than not they were just token gestures to progress. In winter you might think that would be a blessing, but even in January, the sweat never stops. And let's not forget the friendly neighbourhood chimney sweep. Every few weeks he shows up to clean the flue, usually with a small boy in tow, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sent up into the soot-clogged chimney with a brush and no safety gear. You try not to make eye contact. The boy's eyes are rimmed with black and his cough is worse than yours. He might not make it to 14. No one talks about it. There's a fringe fact for you. Victorian chimney sweeps were often orphans or purchased children. Yes, purchased. Forced into dangerous labour so their masters could collect government payments or work contracts. A few bakehouses, especially the older ones with high stacks, actually had built-in crawl spaces where these boys could scurry in to clear clogs by hand. You sometimes hear the scrapes and thuds as they work. Once you thought you heard one crying, but the noise could have just been a rat caught in the pantry door again. Some historians argue that not every bakehouse was this hellish. There's ongoing debate about the quality and conditions of smaller village bakeries versus city operations. Rural setups may have been slightly better, more ventilation, less crowding, but they also had fewer customers and tighter margins, so the pressure to cut corners was even higher. There's no consensus, just anecdotal horror stories in both directions. You grab another sack of flour, hoisting it over your shoulder, with the grim determination of someone who's too tired to scream. The cloth splits slightly as you heave it into the mixing trough, and a puff of fine white powder erupts like ghost breath into the air. You know you'll be coughing that up later, and tomorrow, and probably still when you're 70, if you live that long. You roll up your sleeves again and plunge your arms into the second mix. It's stickier this time, maybe too much water, or maybe the flour is slightly damp from being stored near the wall again. You make a note in your head, move the flour next week. You won't. You never do, it's too heavy. Halfway through the kneading, a chunk of ceiling plaster drops into the dough. You sigh, pick it out, hope it's the only one. You glance up and see the sagging rafters, blackened with smoke, glistening with moisture. Is that mould? Of course it is. You've baked worse. Someone calls your name. You turn and your apprentice, red-faced, sweating, possibly on the verge of tears, tells you the bread rack just collapsed and the display loaves are now on the floor next to a large, very dead cockroach. You nod, expressionless. Of course they are. And so, as the day stretches toward its dreary middle, the oven bell rings again, the next batch is ready, and you open the iron door to retrieve your latest casualties of fire and time. It's hot enough to burn your eyebrows off. Again, you mutter a prayer to Saint Honoratus, the patron saint of bakers, not because you believe, but because, hey, what else is left? The moment you open the oven door, the blast hits you like a slap from a coal-dusted ghost. You instinctively turn your face sideways, letting the full-body wave of heat wrap around your shoulders like a furnace's embrace. Your eyelashes curl from the dry gust, and for a split second your vision goes fuzzy. It's not the first time. Won't be the last. You slide the peel underneath the first loaf with a quick jerk, wrist aching from repetition, and lift it out like you're handling a newborn made of magma. These are your best loaves yet this week. Round, full, the crust a soft golden brown with that whisper-thin crackle that's nearly impossible to get right when your yeast is questionable and your coals full of surprise rocks. You're proud of them for all of 6 seconds, until one slips sideways on the rack and lands with a dull thunk. You bend over and nudge it back into place. It's slightly flattened now, and some ash from the oven floor might have worked its way into the bottom. Oh well, extra fibre. Coal ovens aren't just temperamental, they're vindictive. There's no real temperature control. You learn to read the fire, which sounds impressive, until you realise that means staring at flickering flames through a cracked grate, and guessing whether your crust will burn or your middle will be raw. A few bakehouses use thermometer probes now, imported from Paris or cobbled together by eccentric tinkerers, but yours is all guesswork and superstition. The left side of the oven runs hotter, the back corner is unpredictable, and the centre tends to blacken everything after the hour mark. You've mapped this infernal machine like a battlefield. Here's your historical tidbit. Victorian bakers used test loaves to figure out oven heat. They'd toss a tiny roll in and time how fast it browned. Too quick, and they'd scrape coals out to lower the heat. Too slow, and in goes more fuel. Problem is, coal quality varies wildly. Cheap coal smokes like a burning carpet, and barely heats the bricks. Expensive coal heats well, but eats your profit. You've tried mixing types, layering the hotter coals beneath the cooler burning ones. It's a delicate art, and when you mess up, the results are spectacularly disappointing. And if you think the fire's your biggest enemy, let me introduce you to your new favourite workplace hazard. The chimney backdraft. You might be lucky for weeks, then one random day the wind shifts, and instead of smoke escaping upward, comes down like a vengeful spirit. Your whole bakehouse floods with eye-stinging, lung-crunching smoke. Visibility drops to nothing. You've stumbled into the oven wall before, arms full of dough, coughing like a plague victim. No one warns you about the specific agony of a flour burn. Oh, sure, burns you expect, but flour dust? That stuff sticks. It floats in the air like microscopic sawdust and settles on your sweaty skin, mixing into a tacky paste. Then when the oven flares or the coal pops, even a mild heatwave can flash that sticky mess into a kind of first-degree crust. You've peeled it off your forearm more times than you'd like to count. A slow, disgusting exfoliation that turns your flesh a dull cherry red. And then there's the noise, the kind of noise you wouldn't expect in such a grimy place. The shrill whistle of the oven bell, the scraping of the metal peel against brick, the distant clatter of the apprentice knocking over the water bucket again. You swear he does it on purpose now. You hear the scurrying of mice in the flour bins. You'll pretend you didn't. The squish of wet dough being slapped into shape over and over. It's a rhythm you can't escape, even in your sleep. Now for a weird little historical nugget. Some bakers swore by baking with music. Not for fun. Well, not entirely. but as a timing mechanism. Certain ballads or hymns were the right length for proofing breaks or kneading sessions. You once knew a baker who claimed he could knead perfect white loaves in time to God save the Queen. You tried it once, got halfway through the second verse before a cockroach fell from the rafters into your bowl. The Queen was not amused. Speaking of timing, you have none. Not really. You work by habit, sun slant, the twitch of muscle memory. And yet somehow someone always asks for something you're not ready to make yet. Crumpets, fancy rye rolls, something called a Vienna twist that you suspect is a made-up order designed purely to break your spirit. You sigh and promise to have it next time. There probably won't be a next time. They'll take their business to Smith's across the road, whose bread tastes like damp sadness but comes in fancier paper. There's a debate still brewing among culinary historians about whether coal-fired Victorian ovens produced better bread than modern gas ovens. Some claim the irregular heat created more complex crusts and deeper flavours. Others argue it mostly just burned the outer layers and left bakers guessing. You're inclined to believe both. Some days the chaos does make better bread. Other days it just makes you cry behind a flour sack and pretend you're checking the yeast. The worst part? You're not even halfway through the day. Lunchtime hits you like a gentle slap from God. You don't eat much, just a heel of yesterday's bread, maybe some dripping or a scrap of cheese if it hasn't turned. You eat standing up next to the oven while flipping loaves and shouting at the apprentice not to open the proofing cupboard again. Every time he does, the draught ruins the rise. You explain this calmly, then uncalmly, then give up entirely. Let the yeast gods have their revenge. The floor's getting slipperier. That's always the sign, late shift creeping in. You toss more sawdust down, this time mixed with crushed eggshells and wood scrapings. Everything's recycled here. Everything's reused. Flour on the floor goes back in the bin. The ash in the oven gets spread out to clean it, which just means moving the dirt around. As you reach for the next tray of loaves, the oven flares up with a sudden whoomp, and a wave of heat slaps your arm. You drop the tray, loaves tumbling like stunned birds, and let out a single, eloquent curse that echoes off the blackened walls. The apprentice drops the butter pail in response. Again, you're too tired to even yell now. You pick up the fallen bread, brushing off ash with your apron. You'll sell it to the less picky customers, or the blind ones. It'll still taste fine, probably. You glance at the oven clock, 3 hours until sunset. Then you can rest. Kind of. Sort of. For a few hours before it starts all over again. There comes a point somewhere around the 14th hour on your feet, where time stops moving in a straight line. You're still baking, still pulling loaves from the fire, still shaping raw dough into neat rounds. But it's like your brain has switched to autopilot. Your arms keep kneading because they've done it 1,000 times before. Your legs don't remember how to sit. Your spine is now held together by the sheer force of routine and resentment. You're floating in a haze of sweat, flour, and the baked scent of survival. And your bones? Oh, they're screaming. You can feel every tendon and joint, especially the wrists. Victorian bakers didn't have mixers, of course. If you wanted 100 loaves kneaded, you had to physically mash, fold, and stretch each one by hand. It's not just tiresome, it's punishing. The dough isn't soft and forgiving, it fights back. Especially if the flour's coarse, the water's cold, or the yeast is sluggish. Your fingers cramp halfway through the third batch. Your knuckles swell, your shoulders burn like you've been rowing across the channel. The workbench is the same one used by your master's grandfather. It's made of oak and dented from a century of hard use. There's a groove where your hands naturally fall, literally. Worn into the wood from generations of muscle memory. You wonder, often, if your skeleton will fit perfectly into it once you've completely fossilised. A historical note here. Victorian-era kneading troughs were often communal-sized, designed to hold 100 pounds of dough or more. One person couldn't always knead it alone, especially during peak baking season. That's where apprentices came in, or, if you were unlucky, your own children. Family-run bakeries were often a whole-house operation, with wives, sons and daughters all conscripted into the relentless rhythmic punishment of the dough. And the floor? It's been mocking you all day. Every time you take a step, your knees make that disturbing creaking sound like dry leather. You're not even 30, but you're starting to walk like someone who's been punched in the spine repeatedly by a loaf of rye. The dough trough reaches up to your waist, which means hours and hours of leaning forward, crunching your lumbar spine like a folding chair. You know some bakers who use makeshift supports, crates, stools? even thick belts laced tight around their abdomen to brace the core, as if that's going to stop their spine from filing for divorce. You take a moment, just a few seconds, to lean back and stretch. A little pop in your back, maybe two. It doesn't feel good, it just feels slightly less terrible. Then your master calls down the stairs, voice sharp enough to slice butter. Another 4 dozen white, fancy crust, quick! You stifle a groan, not just regular bread, but the good stuff. The one that requires egg wash, a lighter touch, and more proofing time than you realistically have left in the day. You glance at the ceiling where spiders weave flour-dusted webs and pretend not to be part of this horror show. You get to work again, cracking eggs, whisking yolks, brushing them across proofed loaves with a delicate flick. You're aware your wrists are trembling slightly, and one of the loaves ends up with a yellow smear running off the side like a bad watercolour. You don't fix it. It'll bake fine. Good enough. And here's a bit of quirky trivia for your collection. Bakers of the era sometimes used beer yeast instead of standard baker's yeast. It gave the bread a tangy, fermented edge, especially in places where yeast was expensive or spoiled easily. You've tried it once, made your whole kitchen smell like a drunkard's sock, and the bread tasted like a pub fight. Customers didn't love it, but a few strange loyalists came asking for that loaf with personality again. You never made it twice, couldn't even remember the ratio, kneading continues. You lose track of how many loaves you've made today. The count is somewhere between far too many and whatever number comes after your soul gives out. The walls of the bakehouse pulse with heat. You can feel the bricks radiating warmth back into the room, even though the oven is technically cooling now. The floorboards have gone spongy in places, soaked through from years of damp and neglect. You step around the worst spot where your boot once sank nearly ankle deep and came up smelling like fermented despair. By the way, there's some scholarly debate about whether bakers of this period intentionally pushed through this level of physical degradation, or simply had no other choice. Some say the rise of industrial bread making was a mercy. Others argue that these hardships were a sort of artisan crucible, separating true craftsmen from the weak. You'd like to meet one of those scholars in person and hand them a peel, just to see how long they'd last before collapsing on a flour sack and begging for tea. And you haven't even touched on what the repetitive motion does to your hands. They're permanently raw, cracked. The skin along your fingers is tough, but not tough enough to keep out the sting of salt and water. Every scrape against rough dough is a fresh abrasion. Every twist of the wrist feels like unwrapping your own tendons. Sometimes your fingers seize up in the middle of a task, refusing to open until you smack them against the workbench like a broken clock. You knew one baker, old Morris, whose hands eventually froze into a semi-permanent curve. He couldn't even hold a spoon. Ate soup by pouring it into a mug and sipping it like tea. They buried him with his apron still on, said he wouldn't have wanted it any other way. You're not so sure. As the final batch begins to proof, you glance at the fading light coming in through the upper cracks in the back door. Evening's creeping in, slow and silent. You can almost hear the city exhaling. The chimneys puffing out their last smoke that had children being hauled inside for dinner, distant hooves clacking along the cobblestone. But you've still got bread to load, shelves to clean, ashes to scrape, and dough to mix for tomorrow's sunrise. Again. The fancy loaves go into the oven with extra care. You give them each a little crosshatch on top, then spritz them lightly with water from a clay jug. The crust will blister beautifully if you get it right. If you get it wrong, well, at least they'll smell good. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a voice asks, is this it? Is this what your life is now? Kneading, burning, aching, baking, all while inhaling flour that will probably turn your lungs into something resembling damp bread pudding? The loaves start to rise in the heat. You exhale. At least they're not flat. The moment you realise your lungs are rebelling again comes somewhere between stacking the cooling loaves and dragging a bucket of greyish mop water across the bakehouse floor. It starts as a tickle, then a dry scrape, then full-on wheezing like you're breathing through a chimney stuffed with wet socks. You try to clear your throat, but it doesn't help. You cough. Again. It rattles in your chest like a teapot lid clanging during a boil. You've got what everyone calls the flour lung. It's not an official diagnosis, just the term everyone mutters after they've spent a few years inhaling the same clouds of airborne powder day after day. The fine dust floats in the air constantly, clinging to hair, eyelashes, the inside of your nose, your bed sheets. You breathe it in when you mix, when you knead, when you sweep the floor. Even if you try to avoid it, which, how would you? It still builds up in your lungs like a soft white sediment. Eventually your chest tightens. You cough at night. Your voice sounds like old leather when you try to shout across the bakehouse. There's a sticky layer of flour on your tongue right now. You haven't drunk water in hours, and what little there is tastes slightly of iron from the pump. You swish and spit, but the flour's already settled deep. Somewhere inside your ribs, it's nesting. Cozy little clumps that won't ever come out. Here's your historical anchor. Victorian bakers were widely known to suffer from chronic respiratory illness. What they didn't call flour lung, then we'd now call baker's asthma, an occupational hazard caused by long-term inhalation of airborne flour particles and enzymes. Some reformers eventually noted the pattern. Healthy men entering the trade would develop deep, persistent coughs within a few years, but at the time it was just seen as part of the job, like burns, fatigue, or slowly going mad. You grab a rag and wipe your mouth, your fingers leave a ghostly smear of doughy paste across your cheek. You're not even surprised anymore. You've given up trying to stay clean. There's no point. The flour owns you. It's in your hairline, your ears, probably your dreams. Last week you dreamed you were drowning in dough. You woke up mid-cough, arm tangled in a sackcloth apron, gasping for breath like you'd just escaped from a bakery-themed nightmare. And now, on top of everything else, the heat's rising again. The last batch is baking, but the oven's coals haven't quite died down as they should. The flue isn't drawing properly, and the smoke's curling back into the room again. That distinctive greasy coal smoke smell starts to blanket the air, somewhere between burnt toast and misery. You think about opening the back door, but last time you did that, half the proofing loaves collapsed from the cold draft, and a stray cat walked in and peed in the corner. So no, you'll just breathe the poison. You pause for a moment, hand on the edge of the kneading trough, eyes stinging. The sweat on your brow has dried and re-dried so many times today it feels like crusted salt. You breathe in, shallowly, and cough again. Your throat feels like someone dragged a bristle brush through it. You swallow a clump of air and think about quitting. But what would you do? You've been doing this since you were 10, maybe younger. Apprenticed at 11, burned at 12, sleep-deprived by 13, and now a full-grown baker with lungs that hate you. You never had another plan. You can't even remember wanting one. Here's something from the margins. A few eccentric bakers, especially those in bigger towns like Leeds or Manchester, tried wearing dust masks. Not like modern ones, of course. These were homemade cloth filters tied around the mouth and nose, sometimes soaked in vinegar or herbal tinctures. Most didn't work. Some actually made it worse, trapping moisture and turning your breath into a hot, sour fog. But there were always rumours. This baker swore by a peppermint lining that one used a beeswax-treated linen. You tried one once, you nearly fainted from heat and tossed it in the ash bin. And now there's shouting upstairs. A customer. Loud. Female. She wants her bread early, but she's refusing to pay because her crust was like a brick last week. You barely make out the details. You catch the words lawsuit and justice. You exhale sharply and sink back into your work, letting your master handle the social warfare. You've got your own battle in here, with this ever-thickening air and your ever-thinning patience. You mop the floor again, though it doesn't make a difference. The damp flour paste underfoot just rearranges itself. You're not cleaning, you're redistributing failure. There's a moment when the final loaves emerge from the oven steaming gently, golden and smooth like something actually beautiful that you almost feel proud. You pick one up with the peel and thump its underside, hollow and warm, exactly what you want to hear. You place it on the rack, then another, you've done it. The day's work is nearly complete. The floor is caked, your lungs are coated, your joints are lava, but the bread is decent. And in this life, that's a victory. And yet you're haunted by a scholarly whisper. Some researchers today question whether this was all truly necessary. Could the bakehouses have been better ventilated? Could flour storage have been improved? Could someone, anyone, have invented a filter system that didn't involve old socks and desperation? The answer is yes, but in a time when workers were considered disposable and reform was glacial, the answer didn't matter. You peel off your apron, it's stiff with dried dough and smells like coal and vinegar. Your shirt underneath is glued to your back, you're not sure if it's sweat or steam, probably both. Your hands shake as you unlace your boots. Your breath wheezes slightly with each movement. Your fingertips are dusted white. and your fingernails have that same thin line of grime that never really comes off no matter how hard you scrub. You leave the final clean-up to the apprentice who's curled up on a flour sack, probably passed out. His hand is still holding the mop like a torch. You let him sleep. You open the back door just a crack and let in a sliver of cool evening air. It smelled like horse droppings and chimney soot. You breathe in, cough once, and breathe again. Tomorrow starts at 2 a.m. You try not to think about it. The coin in your palm is warm from your sweat, even though it barely left the customer's hand 2 minutes ago. A single shilling, maybe a penny extra if they were feeling generous or guilty. You glance at the tiny stack in the till, barely more than a handful of loose change and flour-flecked notes, and wonder for the 1,000th time how this is supposed to pay for coal, flour, salt, yeast, water, labour, soap, and still leave you enough to buy something resembling dinner. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Being a Victorian baker wasn't just hard work, it was stupidly, unfairly, insultingly underpaid. You put in 17-hour days, lost your lungs to flour dust, got burns in places you didn't think skin could burn, and still, you were often poorer than the people buying your bread, especially if you worked under someone else. Which you probably did. Being an independent baker meant upfront capital, buying or leasing the building, sourcing ingredients in bulk, paying off inspectors, and dealing with a landlord who'd charge you extra because, quote, your chimney makes the building smell like burnt dinner. So instead here, you work for a master baker. You get room and board, sure, but room means a cot next to the flour bins, and board means leftovers, sometimes. You get a couple of pence per week if you're lucky, but mostly you work for experience, which sounds suspiciously like a Victorian version of unpaid internships. Except instead of coffee runs and filing, you're burning your fingers off and developing early onset arthritis. Let's knead in a historical fact here. The average journeyman baker in Victorian England earned around 15 to 20 shillings a week, depending on the location and type of shop. But here's the catch. You usually had to work 6.5 days a week, with 12 to 18-hour days. Apprentices often received nothing but housing and food, and sometimes even paid for the privilege of learning the trade. Yes, paid. To work, to be yelled at, to maybe someday be the one doing the yelling. Your boots are coming apart, again. You've stitched them twice already, but the leather is cracking at the toe, and you're one more rainstorm away from full-on trench foot. You consider asking your master for a boot allowance, but last time someone did that, he gave them a roll of twine and a look that could curdle milk. You've seen bakers limp through shifts on twisted ankles, on blistered feet, with cuts so deep you could see the second layer of skin, wrapped in rags, dusted in flour, and ignored. One guy down the street had an infected blister that turned black. He still came to work, dragging his leg like a haunted loaf of rye, because missing a shift meant no bread for his family, or for him. The fringe stories are even better. Some journeymen were so broke they slept under the oven at night, half for warmth, half because their rented rooms were miles away and unsafe to reach after dark. You hear of one poor lad in Bristol who reportedly sold his hair to a wig maker just to afford new kneading troughs after a rat died in his old one. Not his fault, but still his expense. And here's something bleakly hilarious. Victorian poor laws often meant that if you had a steady job, like baking, you couldn't qualify for any form of public assistance. So if you got sick or injured and couldn't work, you might not be eligible for help unless you officially declared yourself destitute, which often meant surrendering everything, including your tools, and moving into the workhouse. That delightful slice of institutional despair where dreams go to die and bread, ironically, was mostly gruel. There's debate among labour historians about whether bakers had it uniquely bad compared to other trades. Some point to coal miners, chimney sweeps, or matchstick girls and say, well, at least bakers didn't die at 30. But then you look at the medical records, the death certificates, and the litany of lung issues, skin diseases, chronic exhaustion, and early onset rheumatism, and you start to realise maybe they did die young, just less dramatically. Even if you made it to middle age, your body wouldn't thank you. Your hands would be curled from tendon damage, your back would be bent, your knees would sound like you're carrying a pocket full of marbles, but you'd still be dragging sacks of flour and lifting 100-pound breadboards because retirement wasn't a thing. You just worked until you dropped, or until you became the old one at the corner, muttering about damp dough and drooling into your tea. Your boss, let's call him Master Elwood, is counting today's takings upstairs, and you can already hear the huff in his breath that says profits are down again. You brace for impact. Sure enough, the footsteps pound down the wooden stairs, and his voice slices through the quiet. Cut the milk bread batches by a half. Not worth the extra eggs. You nod without arguing. You learned long ago not to push back. You had a friend, Callum, who once told his boss that shorting batches was hurting customer loyalty. The next day he was replaced by a cousin who worked cheaper. You think Callum works at the docks now, or maybe the docks worked on him. There's no dignity in this. Not really. No prestige. Bakers aren't seen as artisans or miracle workers, though you arguably are. You turn raw, unreliable ingredients into hot, fragrant bread, using skill, timing, and sheer masochism. But no one celebrates you. People respect butchers. They've got knives and blood. People admire chefs. Flame, flair, French accents. But bakers? You're background noise. Essential yet invisible. The first one's blamed when grain prices rise, and the last one's thanked when the bread comes out perfect. You sometimes fantasize about saving up enough to open your own little bakehouse. Just one oven, a modest counter, fair prices, and good bread. But then you think about what it would cost, not just in money, but in your sanity. You've seen what being the boss does to people like Elwood. It doesn't make them happier, it just makes them meaner, more hollow-eyed, clutching at pennies like they're the last crumbs of decency. You sweep the shop floor again, even though no one asked you to. It's quiet now, the loaves are cooling, the apprentice is asleep again, and the street outside is dimming under gaslight. You pocket your coin, 1 shilling, maybe 2 if you're lucky tomorrow. You'll spend half on coal, the rest on tea or boot polish or some meat scraps if the market's kind. There's nothing left for saving, no room for dreams. Still, you set your alarm for 2 a.m, just in case you wake up to find it was all somehow worth it. You don't remember choosing this life, not really. You remember being small, probably 8 or 9, when your uncle said something like, "He's got strong hands for a lad." And the next week you were sweeping flour off a floor at dawn in exchange for half a bowl of porridge and a pat on the back. That was your apprenticeship. No papers, no ceremony, just blisters, grime under your nails, and the expectation that you'd show up every day without ever asking why. Victorian apprenticeships weren't education, they were servitude with extra bread crusts. You were called boy even when you turned 20. You lived where you worked, usually in a corner behind a curtain or under the stairs next to the coal bins. If you were lucky, you got a mattress. If you weren't, you slept on flour sacks, which might sound fluffy until you realise they're lumpy, smelly, and full of mites. Not figuratively, actual mites. Little flour-coloured devils that crawled into your ears and made you scratch your scalp like a dog with fleas. You were under the full control of your master. Wake when told, work when told, eat when permitted, sleep if no chores were left. Any mistake, burned loaves, mismeasured salt, forgetting to sweep the ash earned you a cuff to the back of the head, or worse, verbal. Abuse was constant. Physical abuse was normalised. You didn't call it that. You just called it training. Here's your historical beat. Most Victorian apprenticeships lasted around 7 years. During that time you weren't paid. In fact, your family might have paid them to take you, or you were taken from an orphanage and placed into the trade. No labour laws protected you. No breaks were legally required. And once you started, leaving early was nearly impossible without being labelled a runaway or deserter. That meant the police could drag you back by the collar, and sometimes did. You were expected to prove yourself constantly. Run errands, fetch coal, carry 50-pound flour sacks upstairs, knead until your wrists went numb, and scrub every surface until it gleamed, only to watch it get instantly recoated in flour dust and soot. No complaints, no talking back, only nods and silent rage. One time you dropped a tray of buns, right as the inspector came in. Your master screamed so loudly the man himself had to step in and say, "Easy now, I don't think he meant it." You never forgot that. Not because you were grateful, but because it was the only time in your entire apprenticeship that someone told your master not to hit you. And here's a wonderfully dismal fringe detail. Some bakehouses used their apprentices as human timers. No joke, the master would shout, "Sing 2 verses of Greensleeves and then check the crust," or "Count to 200 before opening the oven." You became a living hourglass, measuring time with your breath while sweating buckets in the corner. If you messed up, the loaf burned. If the loaf burned, you got the blame, and likely a new bruise. People today think of apprenticeships as noble, the romantic notion of learning a craft from the ground up. But in the Victorian bakehouse, it was ground up in every sense. Your health, your confidence, your sense of autonomy. Your body got strong, sure, but it also got broken. Your mind got sharper but more cynical. You stopped asking why things were unfair. You stopped asking anything, really. There's a long-standing debate among scholars about whether apprenticeships were acts of social mobility or just extended child labour with better branding. Some argue that they provided a pathway out of poverty, eventually. Others say the toll they took on physical and mental health made them a trap, especially for orphans or poor children with no support system. You're inclined to side with the latter. You survived it, yes. But at what cost? You had a bunkmate once, Henry, a bright-eyed lad who wanted to be a pastry chef. He used to hum while kneading, always cheerful, always hopeful. Said he was going to move to London and open a shop with glass windows and pink cakes. He lasted 8 months before collapsing during the holiday rush. Pneumonia, or maybe exhaustion. Either way, they carted him out in the back of a bread cart and didn't even cover his face. You never saw him again? You wanted to go to his funeral, your master told you. Get back to work, yeah? Dead boys don't bake. So you worked. You always worked. And when your apprenticeship ended, there was no grand celebration, no certificate, just a muttered, "You'll do," and the quiet understanding that now you were expected to take on an apprentice of your own. Someone younger, greener, and just as scared as you were at that age. The cycle continues. You promised yourself you'd be different, kinder, fairer. But then the oven flares, the flour delivery is late, the customer screams about underdone loaves, and your apprentice stares at you like a confused turnip after forgetting to salt the dough. And suddenly your patience vanishes. You shout, maybe you even throw a rolling pin. You hate yourself for it. But it happens. It always does. You sit now, slouched in the back room with your head in your flour-coated hands, wondering what you've become. Not your master, surely. You still have some heart left, but you're tired. So tired. And sometimes that kindness gets buried under fatigue, under soot, under the pressure to just survive another baking day. You hear the apprentice, Tommy, bustling in the front. Dropped something again. Clumsy but eager. You were the same once, maybe still are. You sigh, stand, and head out to help him. You don't yell this time, just fix the display and tell him to watch the corner of the tray, that's where it warps. He nods, red-faced, and goes back to sweeping. You watch him a moment longer and remember Henry. Then you turn back to the oven. It's nearly midnight. Time to prep the starter for tomorrow. Because 2 a.m. comes fast. Always does. You're halfway through measuring out tomorrow's flour when the rat scurries across the shelf. Not a small one either. This is the seasoned kind, fat on crumbs and completely unbothered by your existence. You pause, scoop still in hand, and make eye contact with it like two weary co-workers acknowledging each other's suffering. It stares back, beady-eyed and insolent, then disappears behind a sack of barley like it pays rent here. You mutter something unkind and go back to weighing the flour, more annoyed that it slowed you down than anything else. You try not to think about what you've seen rats do in the bakehouse over the years, falling into open bins, nibbling at crusts, dying dramatically in inconvenient corners. You've pulled one out of the water barrel once, bloated, stiff and grinning. And if the customers ever knew, let's just say they'd still come. They always do. Where else are they going to get their morning loaf? But the truth is, sometimes you're the reason the bread is the way it is. Not you specifically. Well, sometimes you. But the trade itself, the expectations, the shortcuts no one talks about, because they're what keep the lights on. You remember the first time you saw it? The bucket of chalk powder, the alum, the bone dust. Just a pinch, your master had said. No more than a sprinkle, lightens the bread, makes it whiter. The ladies like it white. You didn't know any better at the time, you just followed instructions. Your job was to stir, knead, and pretend you didn't see what was going in. And eventually, when it became your job to mix the ingredients yourself, you found your own version of that just a pinch. Alum, sometimes a little plaster of Paris. In lean weeks, even ground rice or stale biscuit crumbs would find their way into the flour. Here's your grim little historical reality. Victorian bread adulteration was rampant. Bread was often whitened with alum, a chemical compound that made loaves appear cleaner and softer, while masking the use of inferior flour. Problem is, it also caused digestive issues, constipation and long-term health problems, especially in children. It wasn't technically illegal for most of the century, and even when it was, enforcement was rare and half-hearted. Most bakers didn't do it out of malice. They did it because flour was expensive, profits were razor-thin, and customers demanded soft, white loaves, but balked at the price of real quality flour. So you had two options: lose your business, or lose your scruples. Guess which most people chose. You tell yourself it's not that bad, it's not arsenic. You're not one of those bakers, the ones who literally used white lead powder. That was rare, you think. A fringe case, a scandal. But still, you know exactly which barrel to dip into when the week's earnings don't cover the next flour delivery. And you've gotten good at not looking directly at it when you do. There's a story still whispered among the older bakers about a man named Griggs who tried to be pure. Used only the best flour, refused to use additives, sold loaves at a loss to keep his conscience clean. He went bankrupt in a year. His shop became a cobbler's storefront. And Griggs, last anyone heard, he was chopping firewood for the local inn, coughing up lung butter and mumbling about moral superiority between hacks. Of course, not everyone looked the other way. Reformers came sniffing around from time to time, especially after food scandals hit the press. Newspapers ran lurid headlines like "The poison in our daily bread," and printed sensational drawings of bakers cackling while tipping poison into the dough. They meant well, probably, but all it really did was scare the public and make the inspectors more dramatic. And speaking of inspectors, yours is due next week. Inspector Mabbit, round man, smells like pickles and paper, shows up with his pocket scales and a face that says he'd rather be anywhere else. You've never failed one of his visits, but that's mostly because you've learned how to time things. A clean apron, a half-dozen perfect loaves displayed just right, and the rest of the kitchen shrouded in well-placed shadows. There's a scholarly debate about whether Allen bread really was a health crisis, or just an overblown moral panic. Some argue the quantities used were too small to cause widespread harm. Others point to rising digestive complaints among working-class families during the mid-1800s. But the truth sits somewhere in the middle, enough to raise eyebrows, not enough to stop the practice. You sigh and close the barrel of flour. You use the good stuff tonight, just in case. Sunday orders are higher, and the last thing you need is complaints about gritty crusts or funny-tasting middles. One more round of accusations and you'll lose half your regulars to that smug monster Thomas over on Braid Street. You hate Thomas. His apron is always perfectly clean, his smile always rehearsed. You've tasted his loaves. They're fine. Not great. But he doesn't use alum, or so he claims. You sit for a moment on an overturned milk crate, back aching, and pick at a callus that's turned into a crater on your thumb. The bakehouse is quiet now. Just the ticking of the old clock and the occasional shuffle from the upstairs quarters. Your master is asleep or drunk or both. The apprentice is snoring into a tray of cooling rolls again. You leave him be. You know that sleep. You think about the widow who accused you last week, claimed your bread made her son sick, said it smelled like paint. You were lucky she didn't know enough to demand a test or bring in the constable. But the rumour spread. 2 regulars haven't come back since. You've cut corners more carefully since then, but the memory lingers, her face pale, voice shaking, eyes full of something that wasn't just anger. It was fear, and it was probably deserved. Still, what are you supposed to do? Tell the landlord you'll pay rent with integrity? Buy the good flour with coins made from conscience? The coals are nearly out. The ashes in the oven glow faintly, and the warmth is fading from the walls. You stand and stretch, limbs crackling. One last sweep, one last tray to stack, then sleep. But before you turn in, you glance at the barrel, the one with the special additive. You close the lid tight, press your hand to the top, and whisper without thinking, "Not tomorrow." You don't say never, you say not tomorrow, because tomorrow's Sunday, and people expect their bread. By the time the sun rises on Sunday, you're already 3 hours into a batch that refuses to cooperate. You've punched the dough down twice. It still bounces back like it's mocking you. You add more flour, then less, then a splash of warm water that promptly soaks your sleeve up to the elbow because, of course, the bowl has a crack you forgot about. You wipe your arm on your apron and resist the urge to scream. Sunday baking is its own special hell. You might think it's lighter, calmer, a little Sabbath breathing room. It isn't. It's busier. People buy double because they know you won't be baking Monday morning. The law says you're not allowed to, which means every family in town needs enough bread today to get through until Tuesday. Double the loaves, double the pressure, and triple the chance of everything going wrong. Always does. Already the shop bell's ringing. Customers are out early, some in Sunday best, some still in slippers. All of them want bread, and not just any bread. They want their bread. The one with the thicker crust. The middle one on the second shelf, the one that's slightly paler than the rest. The one you accidentally gave away to the wrong person 10 minutes ago, which you now have to pretend wasn't done yet. You offer another loaf. They sniff it, grumble, take it anyway. You don't apologise, you're too tired to lie politely. Let's sprinkle in a historical tidbit. In Victorian England, laws restricted baking on Sundays, especially after the Bakehouse Regulation Act of 1863. Technically, baking was allowed up to a certain hour, but shops had to be closed by mid-morning. It was meant to give workers a rest day. In practice, it just compressed all orders into a frantic overnight bake-off, where your only Sabbath blessing was the hope that you didn't drop dead halfway through the kneading trough. So you started earlier than usual, midnight instead of 2, which means you're running on less than 4 hours of sleep. Again, your eyes burn, your back twinges every time you bend, your left hand has been twitching involuntarily all morning. It looks like it's trying to escape. And the customers? They're a symphony of complaints. Too much crust, not enough crust. Bread too light, bread too heavy. Why does this taste different? Where's the sesame loaf? My husband liked last week's better. You smile, nod, clench your teeth, and mentally calculate whether a single act of petty violence would be worth the time you'd have to spend explaining it to a magistrate. You duck back into the bakehouse just as the apprentice drops a tray of buns. Again. The crash is deafening. He stammers, tries to apologise, and nearly steps into the hot ashes by accident. You grab his arm before he burns himself, giving him a stern look and tell him to get the broom. Not because you're angry, but because you're too tired to fix it yourself. And he needs to learn. You needed to learn once too. And here's a bit of fringe fact to chew on. Victorian customer service didn't include refunds. If someone was angry about their bread, they took it out on you, verbally, physically, or by reporting you to the inspector. There were cases of bakers being dragged to court for underweight loaves, for cheating the scale, or for selling damaged goods. Some even had to defend themselves in front of local magistrates over crust consistency. Imagine explaining bread was burnt because the wind changed direction and backdrafted my coal oven to a man in a powdered wig who's never touched dough in his life. And yet, there was no winning. No amount of perfect crusts or neatly sliced loaves bought you peace. If your bread was too good, people suspected you were cheating. If it wasn't good enough, they said you were lazy. And if you raised your prices, because flour went up or eggs were scarce, they acted like you'd kick their cat and laughed about it. There's a story still told among the older bakers about the bread riot of 48. A hot summer, a bad grain harvest, prices spiked, and suddenly mobs were looting bakeries, smashing windows, dragging bakers into the streets. Your old master had his shop ransacked during it. Said they tore every loaf in half looking for cheats. What cheats exactly no one knew, but try explaining market economics to a starving mother with 3 kids and no dinner. Sometimes, even when the laws weren't after you, the rumours were. You hear whispers. He cuts his dough. She waters the yeast. They use old scraps in the new mix. Competitors talk. Customers repeat it. You could lose half your clientele overnight because someone claimed your bread smelled strange. You once caught a rival baker sneaking around your alley at dawn. He claimed he was just taking a shortcut, but the way he looked at your firewood pile made you wonder if sabotage was on the menu. That's another open debate among historians. How ruthless was the competition between small bakers? Some say it was just good old-fashioned rivalry. Others argue it bordered on economic warfare, complete with slashed deliveries, poisoned flour, and whispered slander. You're not sure where the truth lies, but after the 3rd time your deliveries came accidentally short, you started keeping watch from the roof for a few mornings, just in case. Now, back in the bakehouse, the dough for the last batch has finally behaved. It's rising just right, domed and soft, a little jiggle in the middle like a belly full of secrets. You slash the tops with your blade in a practice motion, 2 diagonal lines, and brush on the thinnest coat of oil to keep the crust from drying out too fast. Into the oven they go. The iron door clanks shut with a sound that's somewhere between comforting and ominous. You allow yourself 1 minute, just one, to lean against the wall. You close your eyes, the sounds fade a bit. The clatter of trays and the clanging of the scale weights in the shop, the dull whoomp of dough hitting the bench. It's all still there, but you step away from it mentally, just for a heartbeat. You let yourself pretend this is fine. Then the timer bell rings, and you're yanked back into reality like a loaf pulled too early from the oven, soft in the middle, doomed to collapse. You check the loaves, perfectly risen. You thump one gently and get that satisfying hollow note. You place it on the cooling rack and repeat again and again until your back screams and your hands sting. Outside, church bells are ringing. People will be heading to service soon, then home, expecting warm bread waiting on the table. Yours. They won't think about the baker. They never do. You'll be asleep by the time they eat, curled into a sweaty, flour-dusted lump under the stairs with ash in your hair and yeast on your fingertips. You check the last loaf. It's good. You live through another Sunday bake.
Barely.
There are only two types of people in the Victorian baking world. The ones who run the place and the ones who get run into the ground by it. And the person running your bakehouse? He's technically your boss, but he's really more like a well-dressed warden with a fondness for shouting and an allergy to compliments. Or maybe she's a widow who inherited the place when her husband keeled over from smoke inhalation at age 42. Either way, you work for someone, and that someone always wants more. More bread, more hours, more obedience, and somehow less of you while you do it. Master Elwood, your current tormentor, is a man who smells like pipe smoke, ink, and stale butter. He keeps the books with military precision and thinks human emotion is a waste of yeast. He doesn't bake himself anymore, not since the gout, but he still lords over the bakehouse like a general on the battlefield barking orders from the stairs, pacing through the front shop like he's guarding crown jewels, and occasionally dipping a finger into the dough when you're not looking. You would complain, but he signs your wages, which means you swallow your pride along with the occasional insult. But not all masters are like Elwood. Some are worse. Victorian bakehouses were often inherited businesses passed from father to son or widow to daughter, or whatever male cousin was still breathing and reasonably sober. And when the man of the house died, which he often did because baking is a health hazard with crusty side effects, the business sometimes fell to the widow. Don't mistake that for empowerment. These women had no choice. Running the bakehouse was often the only thing between them and the workhouse, so they ruled it with iron rolling pins and a voice that could shatter glass. You worked for one once, Widow Nash. She had 3 sons, all bigger than you, all terrified of her. She didn't shout, she whispered, softly, coldly, right in your ear, "Get the crusts right or get out." That woman once fired an apprentice for yawning during morning prep. Yawning, you never even saw him pack, he just vanished mid-need, like the yeast took him. Still, in a twisted way, you almost preferred her to Elwood. She was cruel but consistent. With Elwood, it's a roulette wheel of passive-aggressive comments, sudden demands, and decisions that seem like punishment but are always couched in business terms. Last week he decided you'd bake rye rolls for diversification. Except rye is fickle, and his supplier sent flour full of husks. You baked it anyway, sold none. He blamed you. Now here's your slice of historical reality. By the mid-1800s, the majority of London's bakehouses were family-run, and while men were the official masters, many women, especially widows, handled the daily operations. Some gained a reputation for their skills, others for their temper. But either way, they rarely got credit. Newspapers might praise Mr. Jones's fine white loaves, but it was Mrs. Jones doing the 4 a.m. kneading and firing the lazy apprentices. And while we're at it, here's a quirky fringe fact. In some towns, the widow of a master baker had the legal right to continue trading under her husband's name for a full year after his death, even without guild approval. It was called the widow's year, and it let her earn some income before either remarrying or transferring ownership. Some widows, however, gamed the system, reopening the shop under a new dead husband's name to stretch their right to trade. Morally grey? Yes. Impressive? Also yes. Back in the present, Elwood is arguing with a supplier about coal. Again. You hear the raised voice from the alley out back, something about shorted deliveries, wet coal, and useless scum who can't tell black rock from pig dung. You keep your head down. When Elwood fights with someone else, you get a brief reprieve. A moment of peace, like being ignored by a storm cloud that's busy drenching someone else. You know the signs, though. Once he's done out back, he'll come storming in here and redirect that thunder straight at you, so you get ahead of it. Start preparing the ledgers, clean the scales, make sure the shop loavers are perfectly aligned. You can't yell if everything looks precise. Well, he can, but you'll shave 5 minutes off the screaming. And here's a scholarly debate worth mulling over while you scrape burnt crusts off the peel. Was the dominance of male-run bakehouses a result of social bias, or just a reflection of physical demands? Some argue the heat, the heavy lifting, the brutal hours made it harder for women to stay in the trade. Others point out that women already did similar labour at home, baking, kneading, cleaning, without pay. The real difference, they say, was about who got credit, not who did the work. You believe that. You've seen wives and daughters in the back room at all hours, kneading side by side with apprentices, packaging loaves, managing accounts, And still, when the inspector shows up, it's always Mr. This or Master That. You once watched Mrs. Bellamy bake a perfect batch of crusty white rounds during a flood, while her husband sat on a stool complaining about his back. He got a commendation, she got a reminder to stay quiet when guests were present. You've tried to speak up now and then, suggest better scheduling, different baking orders, alternate kneading methods. Elwood laughs. "Let's not get clever," he says, patting you on the shoulder like you're a dumb but enthusiastic dog. You smile, nod, then go back to working exactly as he told you, even when it's inefficient, because doing otherwise means a lecture that eats into your already non-existent free time. And yet, you know there's no shortage of people who'd take your place. There's always another lad in the queue, someone hungrier, someone more desperate, someone willing to work for even less. The hierarchy is built on exhaustion. No one wants to be at the bottom, but almost everyone is, except for the master, or the widow, or Thomas across the way with his pristine window display and suspiciously shiny shoes. You've never seen Thomas with flour on his hands. Evening creeps in, and Elwood finally stomps up to his rooms. The oven is cold now, the apprentice is mopping again and doing a bad job of it, and you're staring at your own reflection in the shop's front window, blurred by condensation and streaked with grime. You barely recognise yourself. You lock the door, not because it keeps thieves out, they'd have to be desperate to steal bread, but because it signals the day is over. Or more accurately, today is over. Tomorrow's creeping in already. You feel it in your shoulders, in your wrists, in your eyes that barely want to stay open. One more night under the boss's roof, one more day closer to what exactly? You wouldn't think bread could send you to jail. It's just flour, water, salt and patience, right? Maybe some yeast if you're feeling fancy. But in Victorian England, one wrong loaf could mean standing before a magistrate while your neighbours watch, arms folded, judging your crusts like they're signs of moral decay. Mess up badly enough and suddenly you're not a baker. You're a criminal. And the only thing rising is your anxiety as you wait to hear whether it's a fine or a sell, and you've been lucky. So far, but you've heard the stories everyone has. There was that poor fool in Bermondsey who sold a half-quarter and that came in an ounce underweight. Just 1 ounce. A woman brought it back, made a scene in front of the shop, dragged in the inspector, and boom, he's in court by Thursday. Charged with fraudulent sale of staple goods, fined 2 weeks' wages, nearly lost his bakehouse. Then there's the tale of the mould loaf incident. A baker up in Manchester apparently sold 3 green-spotted loaves to a railway worker. The man brought it to his manager, who told a constable, who told the health inspector, who dragged the baker into court. He swore the mould wasn't there when it left his shelf. Didn't matter. The court fined him and demanded public notice of the offence in the local newspaper. His reputation never recovered. His wife ended up working as a laundress to keep them fed. Because see, it's not enough to just make bread. You have to follow the laws. And Victorian bread laws are their own special flavour of madness. You have to weigh each loaf carefully, label it correctly, avoid illegal additives, meet specific standards of crust and colour, yes, even colour. Too pale, you're selling underbaked goods. Too dark, you're wasting flour and deceiving the customer. The inspector could show up any time unannounced, with scales and attitude. He'll pluck a loaf off your shelf, examine it like he's dissecting a frog, and weigh it down to the 1/4 ounce. If it's short, even slightly, you get fined. If it's over, you're technically okay, but that just means you gave away flour for free, and your boss will ream you out for it. And here's your cold crust of historical fact. The Sale of Bread Act of 1836, and later the Bread Acts of the mid-19th century required loaves to be sold by weight, and bakers were expected to mark or advertise the type and quantity of each loaf. Inspectors, empowered by local councils, enforced these laws, and courts routinely handed out fines or brief imprisonments for violations. There were no warnings, no appeals, just a stern-faced judge and a docket full of yeast-related crime. You once knew a baker who got fined for selling bread too early. Too early. The law said loaves couldn't be sold before a certain hour, supposedly to prevent hot loaves from being sliced and going stale too quickly. But mostly, it was to keep things orderly, whatever that meant. He baked extra early for a widow with a sick child. She told a neighbour, the neighbour told the inspector, and boom, another good man punished for compassion. It makes you paranoid. You weigh every batch twice, you calibrate your counter scale every week, you eye every crack in every loaf like it's an omen. Customers complain, sure, But it's the inspectors you really fear, because the customer can yell, the inspector can ruin you. There's a strange little fringe fact that still makes you laugh bitterly. In 1847, a baker in Cheltenham was jailed for selling loaves that were underweight by evaporation. That's right, he weighed them fresh. But they lost moisture over the day, and by the time they were measured, they were technically light. He explained it, brought in other bakers to confirm it, still got fined. From then on, bakers started adding extra grams to every loaf, padding against the weather just in case the humidity had decided to betray them. Of course, adding that extra flour eats into profits, so the bosses hate it. Elwood calls it sentimental baking, and says any man who gives away an ounce is just begging to be replaced. You still sneak in a few grams when he's not watching. You'd rather lose a coin than gain a court summons. Some scholars today argue that Victorian bread laws were an early attempt at consumer protection, and technically they were. But they didn't do much to protect you, the persons making the bread. They protected the customer's illusion of control, giving them a cudgel to beat you with if their loaf didn't meet their fickle expectations. Meanwhile, no one regulated your working conditions, your hours, your wages. If the bread failed, it was your fault. If it succeeded, it was the shop's triumph. You try not to think about it too much. Just bake. Bake carefully, watch the scale, keep your proofing times exact, don't let the crust go too far. Don't underbake, even when the oven's running cold and the coals are low. And for heaven's sake, don't let the inspector catch you testing a loaf with your bare hands. They say that's unsanitary. Like anyone in this job has ever had the luxury of clean fingernails. Elwood had his own brush with the law once, before your time. Story goes he got caught using false bottoms on his bread tins. Smaller interior, standard exterior. Made the loaves look regulation-sized while actually shorting the customer. Clever, but stupid. Someone caught on. A rival baker, probably. He paid a fine, fired 3 apprentices, blamed everyone else, and doubled down on doing things properly ever since. That's why he rides you so hard. He's still making up for the one time he got caught. And you? You've been on the edge more than once. One day the scale slipped. Another, your loaves dried too fast in a winter draft. You held your breath both times as Mabbott the inspector rolled his eyes and tapped his little notebook. But you passed. So far. Still, every morning, before the customers come in, you check your stock and pray, not to any god in particular, just to the bread itself, that it's the right weight, the right shape, that it doesn't betray you with some hidden flaw. Because in this life, one bad loaf could cost more than a meal. It could cost you everything. You'd kill for a proper Sabbath, a real day off, a full sunrise to sunset without coals, crusts, shouting or scales. But instead, you get this. Sunday's closing frenzy, Monday's forced stillness, and the anxiety of knowing the oven's gone cold and that somehow you'll still be blamed for it. Because in the mind of every customer and employer in this soot-blackened world, the baker is always either too slow, too busy, or too lazy. There's never a right speed. Never a day you're allowed to breathe. See, the Sabbath might have been designed as a day of rest, but it sure as hell wasn't your rest. For the Victorian baker, it was more like a 24-hour exercise in high-stakes logistics. You couldn't bake on Monday, which meant every loaf, roll, bun and crumpet had to be made before Sunday morning, and still be edible 36 hours later. Not stale, not dry, not crumbly. Still warm? Don't even dream about it. So Sunday evening, while everyone else is polishing off roast beef and falling asleep in church pews, you're already thinking about Monday's bread, and there's nothing you can do, not legally. The Bakehouse Regulation Act of 1863 made it illegal to operate your ovens on the Sabbath in most regions, at least for retail sale, which sounds fine in theory. Yes, let the workers rest. But in practice it meant a frantic Saturday night, a brutal early Sunday, and then a Monday full of suspicious stares from customers nibbling their now dry loaves and muttering, "Doesn't taste the same today, does it?" No, it doesn't. Because it's yesterday's bread, Susan. So what do? You overbake slightly on Sunday, just enough to add a bit of staying power, but not enough to dry it out. You keep the crust thick to trap the moisture. You hide the Monday bread in the back of the shop, rotate your stock, and pray no one asks for the freshest loaf. Because there is no freshest loaf. It's all a game of delay tactics and hopeful chewing. And sometimes, yes, you admit it, you cheat. You reheat. You warm the loaves over coals before opening the shop, just enough to soften the crust and create that illusion of fresh. The smell fools most of them. Bread smells fresh when warm, but the bite tells the truth. that slightly stiff crumb, that telltale chewiness. You watch their faces as they walk out taking the first bite. Some frown, some shrug, a few turn around and glare through the glass, but they don't come in. They know the law, they know you can't bake today, when, of course, there were those bakers who ignored the law entirely. You've heard the stories, little back alley operations, secret ovens fired up on Mondays, loaves handed out behind drawn curtains. Risky business. The fines were steep, you'd lose your license, might even face jail if caught twice, but customers paid double for it. A hot roll on Monday morning was practically contraband. Fresh, illegal bread. Now that's a Victorian delicacy. Here's your historical fact. While Sabbath baking was technically restricted by law, enforcement varied wildly. In smaller towns, local authorities often looked the other way if no one complained. In cities, however, inspectors and local religious leaders took it seriously, seeing any whiff of the Monday baking as both a civic and moral offence. There were even newspaper campaigns calling out godless bakers who profited through Sabbath desecration. You read that one aloud once and nearly choked on your tea. And now for a bizarre little fringe nugget. There were Sabbatarian patrols, volunteer groups, often religiously driven, who walked the streets looking for signs of illegal trade or labour on Sundays. Imagine a group of stiff-collared do-gooders sniffing around alleyways for the smell of warm bread, peeking into back windows, and tattling to magistrates. One patrol in Leeds was known for walking past bakeries and holding up placards that read, "The Lord rested, why don't you?" Subtle. You had a run-in with one of those types once, a customer who bought 3 loaves on a Sunday, then came back on Monday claiming she smelled fire coming from your chimney. Inspector came that afternoon, found nothing, of course not. But you spent the rest of the week triple-checking the oven was cold. You even posted Tommy at the back door like a chimney sentinel, just in case. The kicker. That same woman came back Tuesday asking if you had any more of the nice soft loaves. You smiled, sold her one, and imagined stuffing the placard down her throat. Some scholars say the Sabbath rules were created to protect workers like you. And technically, sure, they reduced baking hours, gave you a guaranteed break even if it wasn't restful. But others argue it just compressed the same workload into a smaller window, worsening conditions without offering meaningful relief. You're inclined to agree. Sunday might have been a day of rest, but Monday was a day of dread. A day of awkward apologies and lies. A day where everything you made had to pretend it wasn't a day old. And let's not forget the customers who wanted something sweet on their Monday morning tea break. A bun, a scone, something fresh. You'd explain kindly at first that nothing could be baked that morning. They'd nod, then whisper, "But just for me, yes?" You'd say no. They'd wink, "I won't tell." You'd say still no. And they'd leave like you'd personally spit in their jam. Once, you offered a stale bun to a man who wanted a fresh one. He took it, snapped it in half, chewed twice, and said, "Tastes like it's been dead longer than me mum." You laughed. Couldn't help it. He didn't. Back in the shop now, you're rotating loaves, trying to make Monday look like Sunday. You pull the slightly less stale ones forward, nudge the drier ones to the back, and trim a few crusts for those regulars who pretend to be hard of chewing. You sweep the floor, check the scale, and keep glancing at the door, hoping no one asks the question you hate the most. Is this fresh? Because you've got no good answer. The truth is sitting there in every loaf, and you're not allowed to fix it. If you've never stood in front of a wall of uncooperative dough, watching your future slump into sticky mediocrity, you haven't truly lived the baker's life. Every loaf is a gamble. You do everything right. The right measurements, the right temperature, the right proofing time, and still, sometime, the bread just refuses to behave. It's like the ingredients are conspiring behind your back. You know that twitchy feeling, that sixth sense only bakers get? When the dough feels wrong, even before it misbehaves. And on days like this, everything misbehaves. This morning's batch is a mess. You should have seen it coming. The yeast was sluggish when you woke it. The water felt slightly too cool from the pump, but you were in a hurry. The flour from yesterday's sack clumped more than usual, which means moisture got to it, probably from that dripping ceiling beam again. And now, instead of neat, perky loaves, you've got slouching blobs that look like someone sat on them. You poke one with a fingertip. It shivers like a dying jellyfish. You sigh and start over. Scrape the whole sloppy mess into the pig bin. That's a full hour wasted, and half your flour ration gone. Your backaches already, and the apprentices. Nowhere to be seen. probably still dozing under a flour sack, useless as ever. You consider waking him by dropping a pan, but the sound might bounce around this cursed room and trigger your own headache like an echo of regret. There's something poetic, in a twisted way, about how completely the weather ruins your life. Humidity makes the dough sticky and sluggish. A cold draft ruins the rise. Heat speeds everything up and turns your crust into charcoal before the middle is cooked. The moon could blink sideways and the bread would find a way to collapse. You don't bake bread. You negotiate with it, beg it, bribe it with gentle hands and warm cloths, and hope it doesn't make you look like a fool again. Let's fold in a historical fact while we're kneading. Temperature control in Victorian bakehouses was a myth. There were no thermostats, no proofing cabinets. You used instinct. You tested the air with your palm, you left the dough by the hearth and hoped the fire didn't flare. The oven's heat was judged by flicking flour onto the bricks to see if it browned too fast, too slow, or burst into flame. A lot of it came down to experience, muscle memory, and sheer superstition. You swear the bread rises better when you hum under your breath, but you don't tell anyone that. The ovens themselves were treacherous things. Made of brick, fed by coal or wood, they held heat unevenly. Hot in the back, cold at the sides. You learned the quirks of your oven like you learned the moods of your master. Which spot cooks the bottom too fast? Which spot leaves a pale patch on the crust? Which side likes to burn things just enough to make you cry, but not enough to call it a total loss? And then, of course, there's the sourdough starter. Your mother, yours is nearly 6 years old now, passed down from the last apprentice who gave up baking and went into coffin making. You're still not sure if that was an upgrade. She lives in a battered ceramic crock with a chipped lid and a suspicious smell, but she's loyal most of the time, except when she isn't. Like this morning, when she bubbled weakly and refused to feed properly. You think maybe she's dying, which would be fitting. Here's your fringe fact. Some Victorian bakers treated their starters like sacred relics, claiming they carried family luck or spiritual blessing. A few were rumoured to be over a century old, kept alive through careful feeding and whispered rituals. One man in York apparently refused to share his starter recipe with his own children, fearing it would dilute the baking spirit. You believe it. Some days it really does feel like the dough has a soul, and when it's angry, it takes yours down with it. As the sun climbs higher, the second batch starts to rise, and you begin to breathe again. The dough looks smoother, more elastic. Still not perfect, but manageable. You shape it carefully, cradling each round like it might explode in your hands. You score the tops with your blade, 3 slashes, quick and shallow. Then they go under the cloth, covered with a damp rag and your last ounce of optimism. You finally find the apprentice slouched behind the dry goods bin, face down in a pile of flour sacks. He wakes with a start, eyes wide, and offers a garbled excuse about checking inventory. You don't yell, you just hand him a bucket and tell him to clean the trough. If he protests, you'll throw the slumped dough from earlier at him, and it'll stick. There's an open debate among modern historians about how much influence weather actually had on Victorian bread quality. Some argue that bakers used it as an excuse for human error, blaming the fog or the frost when really, they just miscalculated. Others point to detailed journals where experienced bakers recorded daily atmospheric conditions and adjusted their recipes accordingly. You know the truth lies somewhere in between. You're good at your job, but when the wind howls through the alley and the walls sweat like they're alive, even the best baker can't stop a dough from dying on the bench. Back in the bakehouse, you rotate the proofing trays and tap the oven door to test its heat. The metal hisses faintly against your skin. Perfect. You load the loaves one by one, with the long peel, each movement practiced and precise. Your back complains, your wrists twinge, but the rhythm helps. The dance of fire and flour, you close the iron door and exhale. Then you wait. 10 minutes pass, then 20. You open the oven. Steam rolls out in a soft cloud, warm and sharp. You lean in just enough to catch the colour. Golden brown, crisping at the edges. You reach in, tip one gently and thump the bottom. Hollow, done. You pull the loaves out, each one better than you expected. A small miracle, the kind you learn not to question. You line them up on the cooling rack and for a few minutes you feel proud. The bad batch is gone. The loaves rose. The crust crackles as it cools, singing its soft little success song. You didn't win today, not entirely, but you didn't lose. And in this job, that's as good as it gets. You think you've earned a moment to breathe, just a moment. The loaves are cooling, the apprentice has finally scrubbed the trough without somehow making it dirtier. and the fire in the oven has settled into a quiet, glowing ember. You lean against the wall, close your eyes, and let your muscles sag like wet dough. Maybe today won't end with a disaster. Maybe today is just exhausting. You could live with that. But then you hear it. A rattle at the back door, then a faint scrape, and you know before you even turn around that it's happening again. Your competitors are back. It's not uncommon. Every baker has rivals. But this lot, they don't just compete, they sabotage. You've caught them before. Thomas and his boys from Braid Street, smug with their starched aprons and shiny buttons, always looking for an edge. And when business isn't booming, and it never is for long, they take that edge by force. You saw them last week loitering near your coal shed. Said they were just passing through. One of them kicked over your flour delivery. A bag burst, they apologised, smiled, left. You worked double that night to make up for the loss. But this is more direct. You ease the door open a crack and peer into the alley. Nothing. Then movement. Just a blur. A shadow. Too quick. You step outside and there it is. Your morning delivery of salt slashed open, the contents spilling in a sad, gritty pile into the mud. That's not coincidence. That's not rats. That's a warning. You swear quietly under your breath, not loud enough to wake the apprentice, just enough to take the edge off your pulse. Then you go back inside and fetch a broom. Salt's ruined. You'll have to make do with what's left in the storeroom. Maybe water down a bit of brine, maybe barter with the fishmonger for some spare pinch. It's always something. Here's your historical seasoning for the moment. Sabotage among tradespeople in Victorian England was more common than you'd think. With limited customers, high overhead, and zero corporate protections, competition often turned ugly. Rivalries flared into vandalism, theft, and smear campaigns. Baker against baker, butcher against butcher. It wasn't war, it was daily survival. And in this world, a lost batch could mean the difference between paying your rent or skipping meals for a week. One time, a rival tried to spread a rumour that you used dog fat in your buns. Dog fat. The absurdity of it almost made it funny, until customers actually started asking about it. You had to throw out a whole tray just because some woman refused to believe her mouth didn't taste like terrier. You never found out who started that one, but you've got your suspicions. And here's a crumb of fringe law for you. Some bakers fought back with protective magic. Chalk symbols carved into the ovens, horseshoes nailed above the door, bits of mirror hidden behind the flour bins to reflect bad luck. You've seen one master spit into the hearth every morning for bread blessing. Another insisted his loaves failed if his wife didn't leave the room while he mixed the dough. Superstition blended with desperation. When your living hangs on the rise of bread and luck of weather, you start believing in whatever works. You've never drawn symbols, but you did once leave a burnt crust in the alley as a message. Let them know you saw them, that you weren't scared, that you were watching. And truthfully, you are scared, not of Thomas and his ilk, not really, but of what might happen if they ever win, if they take your regulars, undercut your prices, whisper enough poison into the neighbourhood's ears that people start crossing the street instead of walking into your shop. It wouldn't take much. A few bad weeks, and you'd be selling off your tools, or worse, applying for work under Thomas. You get back to work because there's nothing else to do. The day isn't going to bake itself. You inventory what little salt remains. It's enough for a basic batch, but not the fancy ones. No herb-crusted rolls, no savoury twists. Elwood will have words, sharp ones, but you've got answers ready. You always do. You glance at the chalkboard under the front of the shop and update it. Fewer loaves today. A little price adjustment, subtle, but just enough to cover your loss. You know someone will complain. Why tuppence more today, they'll ask, as if you owe them an economy miracle while they walk off with your best crusts. You've learned not to answer directly, just raise an eyebrow, tilt your head, pretend you didn't hear. Back in the bakehouse you hear footsteps. It's the apprentice finally roused from his flour nap. He stumbles in, blinking, hair flat on one side, looking more dough than boy. You hear anything last night? You ask him, casual. He shakes his head. No, sir. You don't believe him, but you don't press it. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he did and didn't want to admit it. Either way, it's your problem. Always is. Some historians argue that these kinds of rivalries were overblown, that most bakeries focused on building trust with their communities rather than undermining each other. But the records tell a murkier story. Police reports from the period mention destroyed bake ovens, slashed grain sacks, even arsenic tampering in one notorious case. Competition wasn't just capitalism, it was sabotage with a rolling pin. You finish prepping the next batch, short on salt, slightly off ratio, but still serviceable. The dough feels tight, not elastic. It's going to bake stiff, too much handling, too little rest. You sigh and start shaping it anyway. There's no time to fuss. You've got deliveries to meet, and if you're late, the shop on Bread Street will scoop up your customers with that smug, poison-free smile. You take one last look at the back alley before closing the door. Just a slashed bag and a few crusts the rats haven't dared to touch. You sweep it away. The oven's hot, the clock is ticking, the war continues, one loaf at a time. You're invisible. That's the truth of it. No one sees the baker. They see the bread, the shop, the warm window glowing at dawn, but you're a ghost with a sore back, passing silently between the trough and the oven. You exist behind curtains, beneath stairs, under soot and inside schedules. When the townspeople pass your shop, they smell your work and smile, but they don't stop to think who is making it. And on the rare occasion someone does notice you, it's never at the right moment. It's when the crust is too brown, when the loaf's a few grams light, when the rolls are sold out and their child wanted one. There's a kind of erasure that happens when your job is something people consume without pause. Bread is expected, daily, reliable, simple. It doesn't inspire wonder. It doesn't get applause. No one throws a party over a perfectly risen loaf. At best you get a nod. At worst you get accused of theft, or poisoning, or laziness. And because you bake at night, always at night, you live on the fringes of time. You rise before the sun, shuffle through dark alleys to pump cold water from the well, light the ovens while the stars are still blinking, and you're nearly done by the time the church bells ring. People are just starting their day as you're halfway through yours. You pass them like a shadow, a soft grunt, a dusted hat brim. They barely register you're there. Let's turn that into something factual. Most Victorian bakers kept nocturnal schedules. Bread needed to be ready by sunrise, which meant ovens had to be lit by 2 or 3 a.m, and kneading started soon after. This flipped your entire existence. You slept in stolen moments, ate meals at odd hours, and rarely saw daylight unless it was filtered through soot or flickering gaslight. You were awake when the world was asleep, and asleep when life happened without you. Try maintaining a relationship like that. Try courting a girl from the seamstress's shop when your free time is 20 minutes between scalding your palms and wiping soot off the oven handle. Try remembering your mother's birthday, when the only calendar you follow is how many loaves are left on the cooling rack. You can't. You try for a while, but eventually you forget how to live like other people. There's a social price to this work, and it's steep. You're the first to miss gatherings, the last to hear news. Everyone else goes to church, to market, to the tavern. You go to the kneading bench, where the only conversation is between your hands and the dough. You hear laughter from across the street and can't remember the last time you made a joke that wasn't muttered at a loaf as you slashed its top. "You better rise, you stubborn lump of regret," you said last week. It cracked perfectly. Small victories. You once had a sweetheart? Elsie. You met her through the fishmonger's daughter. She liked your hands. Strong but not rough, she said. You courted awkwardly, sending crusty gifts wrapped in paper scraps and notes you could barely spell right. For a while it worked. She'd sneak into the shop at dawn to steal a kiss and a warm roll. You told her you'd marry her when the time was right. But the time never was. You missed 2 dinners, then a market outing, then she stopped coming by. Last you heard, she married a butcher. Daytime hours, regular pay, cleaner boots. There's a fringe account from a diarist named Matilda F. from 1871 who described the baker's boys as hollow-eyed and half-deaf from the noise of the ovens, silent like ghosts in linen caps. She claimed they looked like pale ghouls, pleasant but vanishing. You read that once in an old periodical. You laughed, then realised she was right. And there's no break from it. Not really. Even if you step outside during the day, the sunlight feels wrong. You squint, you burn, you sweat faster. The brightness seems intrusive, almost offensive. You prefer the orange glow of coals, the whisper of steam, the quiet shuffle of feet on sawdust floors. You've adjusted to it like a mole to its tunnels. Some historians debate whether this nocturnal lifestyle was universally required, or if it evolved out of necessity due to market habits and social expectations. But it's clear that for urban bakers, especially in towns where competition was fierce and early sales essential, working through the night wasn't optional. It was a matter of economic survival. Customers wanted hot bread with their morning tea, and no one cared what that meant for the person sweating in the dark to make it happen. You shuffle back into the bakehouse now, having taken a short walk just to clear your lungs from the flour fog. Your boots feel heavier than usual, not from mud, just from time. Every step carries the weight of days stacked onto days, like loaves on a rack. The oven is ready for its second firing, and the apprentice is finally managing not to drop anything. Progress. He catches your eye and says, "Do you ever get used to this?" You don't answer at first. So. You slice open a proofing loaf and check the air bubbles. Good. Not perfect, but good. Then you say, "No," but you forget what it was like not to do it. And that's the truth. You don't get used to it. You just become it. You forget what it felt like to sleep past dawn, to eat dinner at dinner time, to see people when they're not in a rush, or shouting or pointing at your bread like it owes them something. You forget the sound of silence that isn't filled with oven creaks and dough slaps. You forget you exist outside of flour, heat, and invisible labour. The shop bell rings. It's late. A customer straggler. You dust off your apron, wipe your hands, and step out front. They smile politely, ask if there's still something warm. You nod, hand them a crusty loaf, take their coin, watch them leave. They don't ask your name, they never do. It starts with shouting in the square, then the sound of something breaking, a bottle maybe, or someone's temper. You pause mid-kneed, hands sticky with dough, and glance toward the window, where the morning light is distorted through grime and steam. There's movement outside, more than usual. Footsteps, voices, the clatter of a cart being shoved aside. You don't need to look to know what's coming. You can feel it. Bread riots have a particular energy, like a storm rolling down the cobbles with purpose. You wipe your hands on your apron and step outside the bakehouse. Just a little, just enough to see. Down the road a crowd is gathering, mothers, labourers, old men with faces like dried apples. They're shouting about prices again. It's too high. They're robbing us. A week's wage for a week-old crust. You've heard all the lines before, you agree with most of them. But they're not aimed at the millers, not the landowners, not the ones who hoard grain or speculate on harvests. No. The mob turns almost instinctively toward the bakeries. Toward you. You duck back inside and bar the door. The apprentice looks up from the coal bin, wide-eyed. What's happening?
"Stay quiet," you mutter. "And don't answer if anyone bangs."
Because they will bang, they always do. Maybe not on your door if you're lucky. Maybe they'll hit Thomas's first, his prices are higher, his loaves smugger. But it doesn't take much to redirect a mob. One cry of, "That one sold me mouldy bread," and they're smashing your windows, hurling your tins into the street, tossing your hard-earned loaves into puddles like trash. Here's your chewy historical truth. Bread riots were frighteningly common in Victorian England, especially during years of bad harvest or grain speculation. The Corn Laws, repealed only in 1846, had caused years of artificially inflated grain prices. Even afterward, poor transportation, weather disasters, and profiteering meant the price of bread could spike overnight. And when it did, the public didn't write letters. They rioted. Bakers, being the visible face of the food chain, bore the brunt. You didn't set the prices, you paid what the millers demanded. But the customers didn't care. All they saw was a loaf that cost a shilling more than last week. All they heard was their children crying at night, bellies empty. So they came for you with bricks, boots, and righteous fury. You remember the riots of '64? You were younger then, still an apprentice, still naive enough to believe the law would protect you. That riot started over meat, but by the time it reached your street, it was all about bread. They broke the bakery window. Your master tried to reason with them, held up a flour receipt shouting about costs. A woman hit him with a boot. Someone set fire to the bread rack. You spent the night hiding under the counter, with your arms over your head and a tray of burnt rolls as your only shield. It took a week to fix the damage. Months to rebuild trust. Some customers never came back, not because you'd done anything wrong, but because they'd seen your shop engulfed in chaos and assumed something must have been off. Today's crowd is smaller, louder though. You hear a chant now, something about real flour, fair price. You're not sure whether to be insulted or impressed. Someone smacks a door a few buildings down. You flinch. The apprentice, to his credit, keeps working. Slowly, nervously. His hands tremble a bit as he mixes. "Are we going to be all right?" he asks. You don't answer, because you don't know. You've done everything right this week. Bought decent flour, skipped the additives, didn't raise prices, But that won't save you if someone's angry enough to need a villain. And bakers? You're always the easiest target. You're right there, behind the counter, flour on your apron, coins in your till. You listen for breaking glass. It doesn't come. Not yet. Here's a lesser-known fringe story. In 1855, a baker in Sheffield disguised himself as a chimney sweep to sneak out of his own shop during a riot. Crawled out the back, soot on his face, and slipped through the alleys until the crowd passed. He came back hours later to find the front of his bakery blackened with soot anyway. Someone had tried to burn the door down. He rebuilt, kept baking, never worked a public counter again. Historians often debate whether bread riots were truly spontaneous or stoked by organised protesters. Some were definitely planned, led by labour groups or agitators who used hunger as a rallying cry. Others just boiled over. A few bad prices, one overheard insult, a child collapsing from hunger, and suddenly a mob was tearing apart the one place that still smelled like comfort. It's ironic, you think, that people destroy the very thing they're desperate for. But desperation makes no sense. You know that firsthand. You've seen people sob as they threw bricks. You've heard apologies whispered as someone kicked over your rack. Eventually the shouting fades. Maybe the constables arrived. Maybe the mob moved on. Maybe they just ran out of steam. You open the door a crack and peer out. Nothing but an overturned bucket and a few muddy footprints. A peaceful enough ending. This time, you exhale slowly, shoulders sagging. The apprentice slumps against the wall like he's been holding his breath too. You tell him to check the flour sacks, just in case. If one has been slashed again, you'll need to cut back tomorrow. He nods and scurries off. Back at the bench, you go back to kneading. Your hands work automatically. Press, fold, turn. The dough sighs beneath your palms like it knows better than to rise too fast today. The rhythm steadies you. There's no safety in baking, but there's consistency, and sometimes that's the closest you get. The customers will come in later, pretending they didn't shout this morning. They'll ask if you have rye, if the rolls are fresh. They won't apologise. You won't expect them to. You'll smile, nod, take their coin, because that's what bakers do. You feed the hand that slaps you, and hope tomorrow brings something softer than a fist. It always starts with the knock, not a polite tap, not the uncertain rap of a customer who missed opening hours, but a firm bureaucratic knock, like the sound of paperwork made flesh. It's mid-morning and you're elbow deep in dough when you hear it. 2 short, sharp raps followed by the faint clink of a pocket scale bumping against a coat button. You wipe your hands slowly, heart sinking. Then you turn toward the front and open the door. Inspector Mabbott. You've come to hate the way he smiles. Not cruel, just indifferent. That's somehow worse. Man doesn't revel in ruining your day. He just doesn't care if he does. He steps inside without asking, already reaching into his satchel for the little brass scale he carries like a religious relic. He greets you with a nod, then begins his routine. Doesn't say why he's here. He doesn't have to. He's the law with flour on his boots. Morning inspections, he says, as if explaining it to himself. Bread weights, quality, labelling. You nod. Of course, as if any baker ever forgets the schedule of these miniature inquisitions. You lead him to the rack of cooling loaves. He selects one at random. Always random. That's part of the fear. It could be your finest loaf, or the one you overproofed by accident while scrubbing mould from the water bin. He sets it on the scale, watches the tiny pointer hover. You hold your breath as slightly over. Good. He makes a note in his book without a word. No smile, no frown, just the scratch of pencil on paper and the muffled ticking of your shop's wall clock, trying to pretend this isn't life or death. He moves on to a second loaf. This one's close, very close. You silently pray for humidity to have worked in your favour. Maybe it absorbed extra moisture overnight. He weighs it, narrows his eyes, then measures its length and width with a tiny folding ruler. You didn't even know that was a thing until he showed up the first time. Here's your fresh-out-the-oven historical fact. Food inspectors in Victorian England weren't just real. They were dreaded. After a wave of food adulteration scandals in the mid-1800s, Parliament granted powers to local health boards to send inspectors into bakeries, butchers, dairies and markets. Their job? Enforce the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, 1875, and its various siblings, which regulated everything from bread weight to milk purity. For bakers, this meant mandatory inspections of weight, ingredient lists and cleanliness. Failure could mean a fine, court summons, or worse, public shaming. Mabbott finishes with the weights and moves on to your ingredient list. He asks to see the flour sack. You show him. He kneels and pinches a sample, rubbing it between his fingers like he's testing sand at the beach. Then he gives it a sniff. You try not to visibly sweat. "Smells fine," he mutters. You nod. It's mid-grade flour from Elwood's usual supplier, and you haven't tampered with it, this week anyway. You keep your alum barrel hidden well behind the coal pile. Not because you plan to use it, just in case. You think of it as insurance, a terrible, morally questionable insurance policy. Now for the best part, the sanitary inspection. Mabbott asks to see the water source. You lead him to the pump. He tests the pressure, frowns, then asks to see the proofing cupboard. He opens the door, sniffs the inside like it's a suspicious letter, then checks the damp cloths used to cover your loaves. One is slightly grey at the corners, not mould, just old. You consider replacing it right then and there, but moving too quickly might look like guilt. So you stand still, hands at your sides, pretending you're not one spill away from catastrophe. Here's a lesser-known fringe bit for you. Some Victorian inspectors were known to carry swabs and chemical testing kits, early versions, of course, involving things like litmus paper and iodine, to test for presence of additives like alum or plaster of Paris. There are even reports of inspectors tasting raw flour samples on site. Mabbott hasn't done that. Yet. But you've seen him taste butter at another shop. You still remember the look on his face. Detached, almost bored, like tasting poison was just part of his daily routine. He wraps up after 20 minutes, says all appears in order. No smile, just those 4 words. Then he makes one final note in his book, closes it with a flick, and tucks it back under his arm. He gives you a look that's not quite approval, but not condemnation either. Just continuation. The kind of look that says, "You've survived today, we'll see about tomorrow." You walk him out. The bell jingles behind him. You wait until he's a full block away before you exhale. The apprentice, who's been hovering silently in the back like a ghost in training, pokes his head around the door. "Was he angry?" You shake your head. Not angry, just watching. Did we pass? For now. Historians love to argue whether these inspections helped improve public health or just added stress to already overstressed workers. Some claim the presence of inspectors encouraged better hygiene, reduced poisoning, and created fairer markets. Others argue it was a way for local councils to raise revenue through fines, wielding their power selectively, more punishment than protection. You've lived it. You know it's both. Yes, the streets are safer, but your heart's worse off for it. You look over the loaves again, none of them perfect, a few bordering on too dark, but they passed, they'll sell. And Mabbott didn't ask about the dried rat droppings you swept behind the sack of barley. That's a win. Still, you hate the feeling that lingers after he leaves. Like you've been touched by cold fingers. Like your work, your literal blood, sweat and flour, has been poked, prodded and passed over without any understanding of what it took to make it happen. He saw your loaves, not your blisters. He weighed your bread, not your sleep. You light a fresh lamp in the bakehouse and go back to work. You want to scream, but there's no time. The next batch is proofing. The next fire needs stoking. The next day is already creeping in around the edges of your life. And someone, somewhere, is probably filling out a form about you. The thing about rats is you stop noticing them after a while. They become part of the background, like the creak of the floorboards or the soot in your teeth. You hear them before you see them, skittering claws across beams, the faint scrape of a flour sack being nibbled open, the occasional high-pitched squeak of territorial disagreement behind the woodpile. You used to jump at the sound. Now you just sigh and reach for a broom. The bakehouse is always alive in the worst ways. It breathes moisture and groans under the weight of decades of grime. The ceiling weeps when it rains. Slow, fat drops that plop into your mixing bowls if you're not careful. The floorboards are warped from water damage, and there's a corner where no one steps anymore because it squelches. Mould grows between the bricks, greenish, greyish, sometimes even pink. You've tried to scrub it, burn it, beg it. It always comes back, like the rats. You sweep what you can, but nothing stays clean for long. Not the walls, not your tools, not even your hands. You wash them, yes, constantly, in cold pump water so hard it leaves your skin raw. But the moment you touch another sack, another bench, another handle, it's like dipping your fingers into soot-flavoured glue. You've come to accept that your fingernails will never be clean again. They belong to the Bakehouse now. And here's your sturdy historical loaf of a fact. Victorian bakehouses were, for the most part, absolutely filthy. Inspectors' reports from the era described them as dens of decay, vermin-infested hovels, and, in one particularly scathing document, more suitable for pigs than people. A common complaint was leaking roofs, damp walls, and a total lack of ventilation. In many cases, there were no separate sinks for cleaning tools versus hands, and the same water would be used for both, over and over until it turned an alarming shade of brown. You've got all that, plus the bonus feature of cracked ceiling plaster that occasionally flakes into your mixing bowls. You try to cover them, but sometimes you're rushing, and the ceiling picks its moments with eerie precision. You've fished out little chunks before baking. You tell yourself it's just lime and chalk. You tell yourself that because it has to be. There's also the roaches. They prefer the warmer corners, the shelves near the oven, the sugar bin you swear you sealed last night. You stomp one this morning. It's the third this week. Tommy, your apprentice, left the door ajar 2 nights ago and now you've got an invasion. You didn't yell. You just handed him the sugar tin and a spoon and told him to start scooping the top inch off, just in case. He didn't ask why, you appreciated that. You're supposed to have a pest control visit once a quarter, but the last one came 6 months ago, scratched his head, threw down some powder, and left without so much as lifting a plank. Elwood said he'd follow up. You can imagine how that went. Here's something crunchy from the fringe. In some more superstitious corners of England, bakers believed that a rat infestation could be driven out by burying a cat's whiskers under the bakehouse threshold. You've never tried that. You like cats. But you did once draw a line of salt around the pantry door, more as a joke than anything. Tommy asked if it was witchcraft. You told him yes. He didn't question it again. You mop when you can, but that's another illusion. The floorboards drink more than they clean. You spread the water around, pick up the worst of the grime, and watch the rest sink into the cracks. The sawdust helps, soaks up the grease, masks the smell, but then it mixes with flour dust and forms a kind of paste that cakes onto your boots. By midday your soles weigh an extra pound each, and there's no shortage of leaks. Not just from the ceiling, pipes too. You've got one that weeps behind the oven, dripping like a lazy metronome. You tried stuffing it with cloth, then wax. Nothing worked. So now you just keep a bowl under it and dump it once an hour. It's become a ritual. You even named the leak Edith. Some scholars argue that the conditions of Victorian bakehouses weren't much worse than other trades, comparing them to tanneries, slaughterhouses, or textile mills. And while that might be technically true, there's something uniquely cruel about filth in a place meant to produce food. You're feeding the public from a room that's never truly clean. There's an ache in that, a guilt you learn to ignore or let devour you slowly. And what does it say about you that you've learned to live with it? That you can identify mould types by sight? That you instinctively wipe crumbs into dark corners where mice already wait? That you've stopped swatting flies unless they land on the dough itself? You don't like what it says, but it's not like you have time to listen anyway. Because the loaves are proofing again and the humidity's rising. The fire's too hot. You'll need to keep the oven door cracked or risk burning the crust. You grab the rag you use for the door handle, a once white thing now the colour of tea-stained regret, and press it to the iron. The handle still scalds your palm, you bite back a curse. Tommy stumbles in with the water bucket, sloshes half of it onto the floor, doesn't apologise. You sigh and grab the mop again. The handle is splintered. You've had it so long it leans permanently left, like it's exhausted too. You drag it across the floor in slow, deliberate strokes. You could do this in your sleep. Sometimes you probably do. Then something falls from the ceiling, just a soft plop. Little blob of wet plaster or a dead moth, or, please no, not another roach. You don't look. You just sweep it into the corner and press on, because the bread still has to be made.
And people still want their loaves.
And no one, not a single soul, cares what it took to get them. You knew it was going to be a bad day the moment the oven boy didn't show up. At first you figured he'd overslept, he was only 9 after all, but by midday it's clear he's not coming. You send Tommy to ask the rag and bone man, who usually knows who's in the workhouse infirmary, or worse, a ditch. He comes back shaking his head. No sign, might be the fever. You nod, silently, and try not to think about it. You liked that boy. Quiet, obedient, scared of everything except the fire. And now someone has to clean the oven. You look at Tommy. He's grown, no longer the bony scrap he was a year ago, but still too broad to crawl inside the flue. You look at the soot-choked mouth of the oven, knowing what waits inside. Old ash, hard crusted flour, the odd burnt raisin or two, and the ever-present risk of a coal that didn't quite die. You sigh, then you roll up your sleeves and lower yourself to your knees. Maybe you're still small enough to fit. In a proper world, this wouldn't be your job. In a better world, it wouldn't be anyone's, but the oven can't be left filthy. A layer of crusted carbon lining the walls throws off the heat and ruins the bake. You've already had 2 loaves singed at the edges and raw in the centre. You can't afford a third. So in you go. Here's your historical gut punch. Victorian bakehouses often employed small children, oven boys, to crawl inside cooling ovens and scrape the interiors clean. With no safety standards, protective gear or ventilation, these boys risked burns, heat exhaustion, and even suffocation. Many died young. Some were leased from orphanages. Others came from families too poor to argue when a baker offered half-penny wages and a crust of bread a day. You were an oven boy once. For one miserable season before your master decided you were more useful above ground. You remember the suffocating heat, the way your fingers blistered just from touching the walls too soon. The smell of stale coal and grease so thick it made you gag. And always the silence. You were in there alone, belly to brick, scraping soot with a blunt paddle and praying not to get stuck. Now, all these years later, you've crawled back in. The heat from yesterday's bake still clings to the bricks. Not enough to burn, but enough to make you sweat within seconds. Your back scrapes against the ceiling. You can't turn around. Just shift forward, one arm after the other, pulling the rag-covered paddle through the ash. You cough once, the soot already curling up your nose. It's like being swallowed alive. You scrape for what feels like forever. The soot sticks to your skin, coats your clothes, clings to your lungs like syrup. You wonder if this is what being buried alive feels like. And then, clunk. The paddle catches on something. You grope blindly, pull it forward. A scrap of metal, bent and scorched. Probably part of an old bread tin that cracked and fell. You shove it aside and finish your scraping, breath shallow, fingers shaking. Then finally you back out, slowly dragging yourself over hot brick with all the dignity of a corpse returning from the grave. Tommy's waiting with a rag and a bucket of water. You dunk your head without thinking, the cold making your vision swim. Then you sit there, drenched and soot-stained, wondering how many more times you'll have to do this before the oven boy returns, or is replaced, or forgotten. You've heard the arguments. Child labour kept the economy going. These boys would have starved otherwise. You've heard the reformers too marching in the streets, demanding inspections and protections, good people, kind voices, but they don't come into the bakehouse, they don't crawl inside the oven. Here's a grim little fringe fact. Some oven boys were chosen not just for their size, but for their ability to hold their breath. It was a mark of pride among certain apprentices, how long you could stay inside without passing out. There were even informal contests. One boy in Birmingham supposedly held his breath for over 2 minutes, won a shilling, and passed out minutes later with smoke poisoning. He survived. Barely. Got a medal carved from biscuit dough for his trouble. You sit on the floor now, breath slowly steadying, and glance around at the rest of the bakehouse. The soot's thicker than ever. You'll never get it all clean, but the oven's better. You can feel it. A kind of stillness in the bricks that only comes when it's been properly scraped. The next batch might actually bake even. Tommy watches you, eyes wide. Do we need a new boy? Oh. You don't answer. Not because you don't know, but because the answer is too bleak to say out loud. Yes, probably. Some other small shape will come stumbling through the door soon. Thin wrists, wide eyes, burnt palms, and another ghost in training. The shop bell rings. You don't move. Let the customer wait. You've earned 60 seconds of stillness. You close your eyes and try not to feel the grit on your skin, the rawness in your throat, the burn on your elbows. There's a debate among modern historians. Were oven boys the worst off among Victorian child labourers, or just another cog in the machine? Some argue chimney sweeps had it worse. Others point to match girls and their phosphorus scars. But for you, there's no comparison. You know what it feels like to be inside the fire, to crawl through soot and pray not to come out coughing blood. You stand, finally. Slow. Every joint protests. You wipe your hands on your apron, though it makes no difference now. You look around at your bakehouse, your battlefield, your prison. The loaves need shaping, the fire needs feeding. There's no time left for mourning, because the oven's clean. And that's all that matters. You might think that as a baker, the literal provider of the staff of life, you'd be treated with some respect. Maybe not praised, but at least nodded to on the street. Maybe a "thank you for keeping my family fed" or "fine crust on that batch yesterday." But no, you're bottom shelf in the pantry of Victorian trades. Forgettable, replaceable. You stand behind the butcher, the fishmonger, the cheesemonger, the milkman, and, insult to injury, the candlestick maker. All of them get more recognition than you, and they don't even have to wake up at 2 in the bloody morning. When you do get attention, it's because something went wrong. A soggy loaf, a short scale, a burnt bottom, then suddenly everyone knows your name. You're the cheat, the lazy one, the filth merchant, selling brick bread and shame. You start hearing your own name mispronounced in the market as if it's an insult. "Don't get it from him," someone whispers. "His crusts taste like coal." You haven't burned a crust in weeks, but that's not the point. One bad day and your reputation bakes in for good. You pass the butcher's shop on your delivery run, and he gives you the smug nod of someone who has it just slightly better. He stands behind a clean counter with neatly stacked cuts, a gleaming knife, and a day job. Customers line up to ask for joints, sausages, and scraps, paying more for half a pig than you earn in a week. He doesn't even salt his own meat, just stores it in barrels and smiles. That's his whole trade, and he sleeps through the night. Here's your crusty historical crumb. In the Victorian culinary hierarchy, bakers were often considered tradesmen, not craftsmen. You weren't a chef, you weren't an artisan, you were a labourer. Your product was a necessity, not a luxury, and as such it inspired no reverence. People ate bread every day, and because of that they didn't think about it, or about you. It's the same logic that makes folks ignore cobblers until their souls split or never thank the laundress until a collar comes back stained. Some say bakers had status. And sure, the master baker in a large town, one who owned his building, employed others, and sold sweet buns in lace-paper bags, he got respect. But you? You're a journeyman, maybe an overworked head in someone else's bakehouse. You wear the same apron all week, mend your boots with twine, and walk deliveries because the pony cart's been out of commission since '73. You're not respected, you're tolerated, barely. Even in your own shop, you're second fiddle. Customers ask for Elwood, the master, even though you do all the baking. He's barely in the room except to count money and scowl at the flour ledger. But because his name's above the door, they treat him like a benevolent lord of loaves. They thank him for the taste. You might get a sideways glance if someone thinks the bread's too brown. The apprentice notices. "How come they never ask you how the bread's made?" he mutters one morning as you slice open a test loaf to check the crumb. You shrug. You've long stopped trying to understand it. You just know that when the bread rises well, they smile at the boss, and when it doesn't, they glare at you. There's a fringe story about a baker in Bristol who tried to elevate his reputation by dressing like a gentleman and calling himself a yeast sommelier. He printed handbills, wore gloves, claimed he could taste the difference between wheat milled in dry climates versus damp. People laughed him out of town. He ended up back behind a counter, red-faced and flour-dusted, with no more status than before, just fancier vocabulary for his shame. Some historians claim that bakers enjoyed local fame in villages, especially if they offered credit or free rolls for the poor. That may have been true. You've seen a few old women light up when you hand them a roll they didn't pay for. You've even had children wave at you, crumbs still on their faces. But those moments are rare and fleeting, and they vanish the second you're short on stock or raise your price by a halfpenny. The bread itself doesn't help. It's not flashy. You can't dress it up with frills or carving like a roast goose. You can't flambe it, flamboy it, or float it in aspic like the pudding makers do. Bread is humble, consistent, underrated, which means you are too. You tried once to impress someone. Baked a braided rye with herbs and coarse salt twisted into a crown. Spent hours on it. Put it in the shop window, glistening and golden. A passerby tapped the glass and said, "Looks burnt." No one bought it. You ended up eating half yourself over 3 days. It went stale before the admiration could arrive. Butcher's getting a new sign, carved wood, painted letters. You overheard him telling a customer it's hand done by a bloke in Clerkenwell. You'll never get a sign. Your shop front has soot in the corners of the windows, and the chalkboard outside was last updated by Tommy, who misspelled whole meal as whale mel. It's still like that. No one corrected him. No one noticed. You joke with yourself sometimes about starting a bakers' union, a brotherhood of underappreciated flour slaves, bound by blistered hands and early wake-ups. You'd call it the Guild of Invisible Men. Slogan: we make your bread, try not to scream at us. You laugh quietly, alone. Tommy doesn't understand yet. He still thinks people care. He watches the customers, listens for praise. You know the truth. They don't hate you. They just don't think of you at all. At the end of the day, you scrub the same bench you've scrubbed for a decade. Your hands raw from lye soap and too much scouring. You sweep the floor, which will be covered in flour again in 6 hours. You check the salt levels, the yeast pot, the sack of barley for signs of weevils. Then you blow out the lamp and close the door behind you. No one will thank you for what you did today. No one will know you were there. But when they slice into that loaf tomorrow morning, that quiet crunch, that's the sound of your work. They just won't realise it. There's something deeply ironic, darkly poetic even, about the fact that the very thing you bake to nourish people might be the thing that poisons them. You've seen it happen. Bread that looked fine. Golden crust, hollow thump, pleasing smell, and yet, a day later, someone comes banging on the shop door, pale-faced and sweating, waving a half-eaten hunk like it's evidence in a murder trial. "This made my Elsie sick," they scream, while Elsie, 7 years old and probably fine by now, coughs theatrically behind them. And maybe they're right. Maybe it was your bread. You always hope it wasn't, but you know the risks. You know what happens in this bakehouse, what lurks in the flour bins and what clings to the side of the water barrel after too many days of making do. You clean as best you can, but no one's got time to scour every crevice when you're baking 300 loaves a day with an apprentice who still thinks sanitation is a type of herb. You do what you can, you scrape, you mop, you pray over the yeast like it's a sick child, but sometimes it's not enough. Here's your hard-to-swallow historical fact. Foodborne illness from bread was shockingly common in Victorian England. Not always dramatic, not always fatal, but frequent enough that newspapers ran regular headlines like "Family laid low by tainted loaf" and "Local girl dies after consuming white bread." Causes ranged from mould to tainted water to flour contaminated with industrial residue. The worst cases involved toxins like ergot, a fungus that grew on rye and could cause hallucinations, seizures, even death. But most of the time, it was just plain filth. That and hands. Dirty hands. Yours, the apprentices, the millers, the delivery boys. Unwashed fingers coated in coal dust, sweat, and God knows what else. Kneading dough that ends up on someone's dinner table. Gloves. Ha! No such thing. You've wiped your nose, scratched your ear, and dug under your nails with the same fingers you use to roll out buns. Not because you want to, because there's no time to stop. And then there's the water. You pull it from the pump out back, which is supposed to be safe. Tested by the parish, they said. Right. Tested once in 1862, probably by a man who drank gin for breakfast. On rainy days it runs cloudy. On hot days it smells metallic. Sometimes little bits float in it. Specks of rust or something worse. You filter when you can, boil when you remember, but again, time, money, pressure. A customer came in last month with a complaint about her bread going funny after just one day. You knew exactly what she meant. That odd sour smell, the strange dampness inside, probably mould spores in the flour. You gave her a new loaf and told her the weather was to blame. She nodded, not convinced. You could see the suspicion blooming behind her eyes. You haven't seen her since. Now here's a fringe story that stuck with you. In 1873, a baker in Hull was accused of causing a cholera outbreak after a dozen customers fell ill. Turns out the real culprit was the water barrel he used to soak his flour sacks. The cloth had been stored in a cellar that also housed a privy overflow pipe. One crack in the stone, and suddenly the loaves were full of something decidedly unholy. The man wasn't convicted, lack of proof, but his business never recovered. The Spread Man, they called him in the street. Children sang songs about him. You've kept your own cellar sealed since you heard that one. There's an ongoing debate among scholars. Was bread actually that dangerous? Or did it simply become the scapegoat for every mysterious illness Victorian medicine couldn't explain? The answer is complicated. The public rarely trusted doctors, but they knew bread. If they felt sick and the loaf tasted off, it was easy to draw the line. Plus, everyone ate it. Bread wasn't just common, it was constant. So when things went wrong, it was the first suspect. And because you make it, you're guilty by association, even if you know better. Even if you check your yeast every morning and refuse to cut flour with chalk or ash. Even if you use vinegar to scrub your prep table and sweep 4 times a day. Still, if someone gets sick and you're holding a peel, you're the villain. Even when it's the milk that curdled. Even when it's the meat gone sour. Bread gets blamed. There was a week last year when the whole neighbourhood caught something nasty. Stomach cramps, fever, the works. Someone said it was your rye loaves. You hadn't even baked rye that week. But people are creatures of habit and fear. They stopped buying for 3 days, 3 whole days of watching unsold loaves go stale. Unsold buns sag, and Elwood hover near the till like a buzzard counting coins he no longer had. You wrote off the loss, took it from your wages. That was your punishment for not catching a sickness you didn't cause. That, and the shame of being eyed like a walking illness for the next fortnight. Now, when you smell something off in the flour, even a hint of mould, you dump it. Even if Elwood complains, even if it means stretching a batch thinner than it should be. Better to be poor than blamed again, but you can't protect everything. You can't catch every spore, every drop, every wayward scrap of bacteria. All you can do is work clean, work fast, and hope. Hope the apprentice washes his hands. Hope no rat died in the wall behind the oven. Hope the yeast didn't ferment too long. Hope no one's stomach turns after dinner. Because they'll never say, must have been the mutton. They'll say, that bread, that baker. And then you'll be the next cautionary tale, pinned to lampposts by the inspector's notice and whispered about by mothers with fussy bellies and long memories. You glance down at your dough now, proofing quietly under a damp cloth. You peel it back, check the rise. Smells fine, feels smooth. You press it gently and whisper, don't betray me. Because if it does, you'll never hear the end of it. You hate baking weddings, you always have. There's something uniquely frustrating about being the least visible but most essential part of someone's most important day. They remember the flowers, the lace, the fiddler who played that one slightly off-key waltz, but not the person who worked 18 hours straight to keep the bread baskets full and the bride's mother from exploding over underbaked dinner rolls. You're not part of the joy, you're part of the infrastructure, like the floorboards or the chamber pot, and it always starts the same way. A wide-eyed girl from the dress shop pops in asking if you can do a little something special for the upcoming ceremony. Just bread for 50, she says, like that's a small ask. Then she adds, and a decorative loaf, maybe shaped like doves or hearts. You nod, knowing you'll end up doing it, not because you want to, but because saying no means you'll be the villain in some breathless tale of wedding woe for the next year. So you start early. You draw a little sketch of what the decorative loaf might look like. 2 braids in the shape of a wreath, maybe a plaited rose in the centre. You know it won't come out like the picture. Nothing ever does. But at least it's a plan. The dough is delicate, sweeter than usual, with milk and sugar and egg yolks stirred in to make it soft and golden. It smells wonderful while proofing. It's the only part of the job that feels even slightly joyful. You assign Tommy to handle the plain loaves. Nothing fancy, just uniform, tight-crusted, evenly browned rolls. He's barely competent at the best of times, but he knows how to shape a roll. Mostly. You show him how to place them in neat rows on the baking sheet. Remind him, twice, not to crowd the pan. Then comes the delivery. You hate deliveries. Here's your fact, plated with some crumbling resentment. Victorian wedding feasts were elaborate affairs for the middle and upper classes, and bread played a critical role, not just as food but as symbolism. Braided loaves represented unity. Round loaves meant eternal love. Some families ordered blessing bread, which was passed around the table before the first course. And while wedding cakes were growing in popularity, they were expensive. Most couples still served fancy breads with jam or stewed fruit for dessert, and someone, of course, had to bake it all. But someone was you. So you wrap the decorative loaf carefully in linen, place it in the wooden basket you use only for special orders, and set off down the alley with your shoulders hunched and your boots flapping in the mud. It's raining, naturally. Light but steady. You try to keep the linen dry by tilting your cap forward, leaning slightly to the side like a lopsided tower of effort. The house is huge, gas lamps flickering, garden trimmed within an inch of its life. A butler answers the door and looks at you like you're a sack of potatoes with feelings. You hand him the bread. He doesn't thank you, doesn't even look at the loaf, just waves vaguely toward the kitchen and says, "You can leave the others in the scullery." In the scullery, that word always stings. You unload the rest of the bread, rolls in baskets, 2 large rye rounds, 1 pan loaf for slicing. You arrange them neatly on a side table, though you know someone will rearrange it immediately and take credit. You've been to enough of these to know how it works. One of the kitchen maids eyes your decorative loaf and smiles. "It's lovely," she says quietly. That almost makes it worth it. Almost. You leave quickly, You've got 4 hours to get back, reheat the oven, and start the morning's first batch. No time for basking in the reflected glow of someone else's love story. And here's a fringe fact, one for the romantic cynics. Some Victorian brides insisted their loaves be kneaded exclusively by a pure hand, usually meaning a virgin, or at least someone unmarried. Superstition held that only the untouched could shape dough meant to bless a union. One baker's apprentice you knew got us passed over for that job because someone spotted him kissing the blacksmith's daughter behind the rain barrels. You, being long past any illusion of innocence, never get asked, which is just fine. Back at the shop you find the oven cold, of course, or... The apprentice forgot to bank the coals. You strike a match with one hand, still holding the damp cloth with the other. It takes 3 tries before the flame catches. The flint is going dull. You make a note to mention it to Elwood, knowing he'll ignore you. As you wait for the fire to come back to life, you take a moment to sit. The bench is rough, splintered in places, but it's solid. You close your eyes and try not to picture the wedding. Warm lights, clinking glasses, the bread basket being passed from hand to hand without so much as a thought for where it came from. You picture the bride smiling, the groom laughing. You wonder if they even know their names were spelled into the crust of that decorative loaf. If they'll eat it, or just let it sit out, pretty but untouched, like everything else you do. Some scholars say bakers were important to community rituals, that their role in celebrations marked them as trusted figures. Maybe that was true once, but in your world, you're an afterthought. They'll toast the roast, praise the pudding, but the bread? They'll call it nice and move on. The loaf will be gone by morning, and no one will remember the hours you spent braiding dough in a darkened kitchen, soot in your hair and hope in your chest. The fire catches at last. The coals hiss and glow. You stand, roll your shoulders, and return to the work. You've still got flour to measure, yeast to feed, cloths to rinse. No time to think about weddings, no time to wonder if anyone tasted the soft sweetness of that decorative crust and thought, even for a moment, of the tired hands that shaped it. You'll never know, and that's the job. Of all the things you can't control in your job, whether flour quality, public moods, rat behaviour, the one that cuts deepest like a knife straight through the crust is debt. Not just yours, everyone's. Because nobody ever wants to admit they can't afford bread. They just start asking softly if they can settle up next week, or get a few rolls now, pay for them Thursday. They smile when they say it, laugh even, like it's nothing, a jest between friends, but it never is. It builds up slowly, a tab here, a forgotten farthing there. You keep a little book under the counter where you write the names. You swore you'd never do it. Elwood warned you it was a waste of ink. But when you see a mother with 3 children and nothing in her basket but a carrot, what are you supposed to do? Say no? Send them away with nothing but their hunger? You give them a roll, or 2, and they say they'll come back. Sometimes they do, most times they don't. And here's your dense, crusty historical fact for the day. Running tabs at bakeries was incredibly common in Victorian England, especially among the working poor. Bakers were part of an informal credit system that kept communities barely afloat. If someone lost work or was injured on the job, the baker was often the first to give leeway, because bread was daily, essential and visible. You couldn't skip it. But those IOUs? They stacked like unbaked loaves in a failing oven, threatening collapse. Today your tab book holds 17 names. 5 with a line through them. That's when you gave up. Or they moved away, or were buried in a pauper's grave with nothing but your bread in their belly. Some of them stopped making eye contact weeks ago. One of them, a coal boy named Artie, left town with his mother after his father was arrested. You're never seeing that shilling again. Tommy asks, as you're writing a new name down, why do you keep letting them? And you don't answer right away. What's the point? You tell him the truth eventually, because they need it more than I need their thanks. You don't say more than I need the money, because that would be a lie. You do need the money. You're behind on rent. Your boots have holes again. And Elwood's hinting he might cut your hours if the shop keeps hemorrhaging crumbs. But what are your options? Start turning people away? Let them walk out empty-handed while you sit on a mountain of stale crusts? Even now in this dingy corner of London where people spit when they see your apron, you still believe in the dignity of food. It should never be denied. Of course, that belief comes with a price. Here's a lesser-known fringe anecdote. One baker in Leeds kept such meticulous records of customer debts that when he died, his son used the tab book to create a map of the poorest homes in town. He marked the neighbourhoods with the highest unpaid balances and used that data to campaign for parish food aid. The local council ignored him, the map disappeared. But his story floated around trade circles for years. They called him the crumb cartographer. You sometimes wish you had the courage to send out notices, formal ones. Dear Sir, Madam, your bread debt now equals the price of a new trough. Please pay or stop smiling at me like we're still friends. But you never do. You're not made of stern letters. You're made of sweat and flour and sleep deprivation. Even Elwood's starting to notice. Why are we short again this week? He asked just yesterday, fingering the ledger like it had personally betrayed him. You mumbled something about coal prices, delivery delays. He didn't press, yet, but you can feel it coming, a reckoning, a moment where he'll demand names, figures, payments. And then what? You erase the book, throw it in the fire? Pretend those loaves were never baked, those hands never reached across the counter, with hope and hunger. Some historians argue that bakers were community heroes for extending credit, cornerstone figures who quietly supported the poor without judgment. Others say it was just business calculus. Give a roll today, earn loyalty tomorrow. Both are true, probably, but when you hand a warm loaf to a shivering child and watch them tuck it under their coat like treasure, you don't think about business. You think about your own stomach, actually. How you skipped breakfast. How your dinner will be whatever's left behind. That half loaf no one bought because it browned too hard. Or the soft bit of rye that started to turn at the edges. You trim it with a blunt knife and tell yourself it's fine. You've eaten worse. Debt doesn't just mean money owed. It means exhaustion. It means standing behind a counter and smiling at people who've forgotten they owe you anything. It means baking twice as much just to give some of it away. It means dreading the knock on the door, not from the inspector, but from the man who wants more on credit when you haven't even broken even. And sometimes, just sometimes, you find yourself resenting them. That old man who always says, "Put it on the tab," with a wink, like it's a punchline. That young mother who never quite manages to bring the coins she promised. That dock worker who still buys tobacco but hasn't paid for a roll in weeks. You hate yourself for resenting them, but the feeling lingers like flour dust in your lungs. There's a loaf cooling on the rack now. Cracked just right. Golden brown, fragrant as anything. You were going to take it home, wrap it in cloth, eat it slowly, proudly. But then a knock comes. A soft one. A boy. No shoes. He asks if there's anything old he can have. You pause, glance at the loaf, then you reach for it and hand it over. Take it while it's warm, you say. He beams, runs off. You scratch his name in the tab book even though he didn't give one. And you tell yourself it was the right thing. Again, you don't really believe in holidays anymore. Not the religious ones, not the feast days, not even Christmas. Because in the life of a baker, a holiday just means people expect more bread, fancier bread, and they want it earlier, but they definitely don't want to pay more for it. You remember the first Christmas you worked under Elwood. You thought it might be different, special maybe, something warm and joyful like in the stories, but it was just chaos with bells on. You've lost count of the holidays since then. Easter, Whitsun, Harvest Home, coronations and jubilees. Days when other people get to lie in bed, drink, sing or cry in pews, while you sweat beside a roaring oven, crimping crusts into decorative swirls and trying not to overbake the ceremonial rye crown that some vicar ordered because his congregation expects tradition. Well, tradition tastes like ash when you've been awake for 20 hours and your ankles feel like broken biscuits. Take today. All Saints' Day. Technically not a major holiday, but you'd never know it from the demand. People lining up for soul cakes and honeyed loaves as if they've suddenly remembered that their ancestors are watching. You can barely keep up. Tommy's burned the first tray, underbaked the second, and now he's sulking in the back like the cakes personally insulted him. You give him a short bark, "Get up or we'll both be ghosts by noon," and he snaps to it reluctantly. Here's your historical crumb of truth. Victorian holidays often triggered frantic baking sprees, especially in urban bakeries. While store-bought sweets weren't yet widely available to the poor, bread remained the centrepiece of many traditional observances. Soul cakes for All Saints, hot cross buns for Good Friday, simnel cakes for Easter. Even weddings, funerals and baptisms required special loaves or ceremonial buns, and the burden fell squarely on the baker, no matter the hour, the weather, or the amount of sleep missed. The thing is, you want to take pride in it. There's something beautiful about a soul cake, really. Rich with spice, dotted with currants, touched with just a hint of nutmeg if you can afford it. You like shaping them, rolling the dough into perfect rounds, pressing in the crosses with a warm knife. brushing them with milk to get that soft, glistening sheen. You like seeing them lined up, uniform and ready. There's a rhythm to it, a comfort, but by the time you're baking your 200th, with your arms sore and your mind fraying at the edges, the charm fades. You stop seeing the cake. You just see another item on a never-ending list of things you have to make to keep people happy, and they are never quite happy. "Do you have any with cinnamon instead?" someone asks, despite the sign clearly listing the spices. "Can I get one that hasn't touched raisins?" another adds, as if you've got some secret pile of bespoke bakes hidden just for them. You smile, or at least something close to it, and answer politely, but inside you're yelling. You find yourself missing the ordinary loaves, the predictability of a crusty round or a plain white tin, something that doesn't require artistry or charm, just heat, patience, and gravity. But holidays don't want ordinary. They want theatre, ceremony, and you're the backstage hand stuck wrangling props and praying the curtain doesn't fall. And here's a little-known fringe morsel for you. In certain rural parts of England, bakers were expected to provide free bread to the poor on religious feast days. It was seen as an act of piety, a way to cleanse the soul. Some even believed that a baker who refused would suffer curses, spoiled yeast, or oven fires. You've had all three, and not just on feast days. If there's a curse on you, it doesn't take breaks. You light a fresh candle near the back table, only to discover your last tin of honey is half crystallised. The good stuff got used yesterday by Tommy, who thought more was better. It's not. Now the cakes taste like melted sugar slathered on regret. You'll have to adjust, cut in some warm milk, pray no one notices. Meanwhile the line stretches out the door, people bundled in wool stamping their feet, complaining about the wait. You'd think he'd have prepared more, one mutters. You glance at the racks, every single one loaded, every surface covered. There's no room for more. You're baking at maximum human capacity. The only way to move faster would be to grow a second pair of arms or sell your soul for a time-freezing oven. Tommy drops another tray, a dozen soul cakes splatter on the floor like little brown ghosts. You clench your jaw. Don't yell. Not because you're patient, but because you can't spare the energy. You scoop them up, toss them into the scrap bin, and keep going. This isn't a holiday, it's a siege. Some scholars love to wax nostalgic about Victorian feast days, describing them as communal events, moments of joy that brought towns together, or maybe they did. For them, the ones eating, for you, they're an unending sprint through a minefield of tradition, expectation, and underpaid artistry. A single cracked soul cake could spark a week of gossip. One cross too crooked, and suddenly you're not what you used to be. You pause briefly to sip lukewarm tea, steeped in soot and disappointment, and then move on to the next batch. The clock strikes 6. You've been awake for 16 hours. Your feet are numb. Your fingers are stained with flour, sugar, and burn cream from where the last tray kissed your knuckles. And there's still another queue outside. You look down at the final tray of soul cakes and wonder, for just a moment, if anyone will taste the labour in them. If they'll bite into the soft centre and say, this must have taken some effort. Or if they'll just chew, swallow, and move on. You already know the answer. You roll your shoulders, crack your knuckles, you've got more to bake, and a holiday to survive. The first snowfall comes early this year, quiet and uninvited. It creeps in overnight, blanketing the alleyways and roof tiles like flour sifted by a gentler hand than yours. When you step outside the bakehouse at dawn, just for a breath of air not soaked in yeast and coal smoke, you pause. It's still, pale. The street muffled under a sheet of white. Beautiful, maybe, if you weren't freezing and behind on firewood. Snow means trouble. You know this. It always does. Not because of the cold, exactly. You're used to that. You work inches from an oven most days. It's the damp, the delays, the disruptions. The coal boy can't get through with his cart. The flour miller's delivery is delayed due to slippage. The pump water's half frozen, and you have to break the crust of ice on the bucket every morning like cracking through the top of badly baked cake. And worst of all, people still expect bread. Fresh, warm, unchanged, as though nothing outside your door has shifted at all. You rub your hands together, stiff and red, and head back inside. The oven needs stoking. It always does. You load it with the last of the dry coal and hope it'll be enough to get you through the first round. If not, well, you'll have to chop down one of the broken stools for kindling. You're running out of wood and options. Tommy arrives late, shivering and sullen. His boots are soaked through. His breath fogs in the cold air inside the shop, and he looks at you with the face of a boy who's starting to understand that this life won't get better, just colder. "Everything's frozen," he mutters. You nod. Then we work faster. Here's your final sobering historical fact. Winter in Victorian England was brutal for bakers. Cold temperatures slowed yeast activity, meaning longer proofing times and inconsistent rises. Firewood and coal were expensive, and keeping ovens hot enough often meant sacrificing warmth within living quarters or baking in shifts to stretch limited fuel. Yet customers didn't reduce their demand. In fact, they often increased it, hoping for comfort food and stocking up in case weather turned worse. Bakers were expected to soldier on no matter how deep the frost bit into their hands. The dough is slow to rise this morning. Even in the warmed proofing box, it shivers and sulks, refusing to fluff properly. You wrap it in cloths and mutter to it like it's a pet refusing to come in out of the snow. "Come on now, don't be difficult." Tommy watches, brow raised. You're not even embarrassed. If talking to bread gets it moving, you'll sing to the bloody thing. It's hours later when you finally get the first batch in the oven. You sit on a flour sack while you wait, feet sore, hands trembling slightly from the cold and the hours. You hear the loaves shifting in the heat, their crusts forming, the soft hiss of steam escaping. It's the only nice sound you'll get today. You close your eyes for a moment just to listen. Then the shop bell rings. Of course, you trudge to the front. It's an old woman, face like a dried apple. She asks for a 6-penny loaf and a roll for her granddaughter, if there's one to spare. You hesitate just a moment, but you've already written off today's earnings. You hand her the roll with a nod. She says thank you like it's a prayer. You tuck your hands in your apron as she goes. Later it starts to snow again. Thick flakes this time, slower, heavier. You watch it build up outside the window, coating the cobblestones, dusting the bakery sign. You can't remember the last time you saw something get cleaner by being covered. For a moment it looks like the bakehouse could be anywhere, like it's been erased, made blank. Pure, but you're still here. The fire begins to die and you know there's not enough fuel for another batch. You'll need to choose. Bake the rest at a lower heat or save what you can for tomorrow. You opt to bake now, because tomorrow might not come, not in the way you need. Tommy says nothing, just works beside you in silence. He doesn't complain anymore. He's learning. And here's your last fringe fact for the night. Some Victorian bakers believed that the first snow of winter carried luck, that if you caught a flake on your tongue before sunrise and didn't speak for 5 minutes after, your oven would never crack a crust too soon. You've never tried it, but tonight when you step out back for a final breath, you do, just in case. A flake lands on your tongue. It tastes like nothing. You say nothing for 5 minutes. Inside, the final loaves bake quietly. Tomorrow you'll do this again. The same cold, the same ache. Maybe worse. You'll wake in the dark, feed the fire, shape the dough, shoulder the day's weight. No one will notice, no one will thank you, but somewhere out there, someone will bite into a warm crust and feel just a little less hungry. And that will have to be enough. So here you are, sitting on the edge of the bench, your back against the cool brick wall of the bakehouse, the last embers in the oven sighing out their heat like a tired old dog. The snow outside has settled into silence. Tommy's gone home, finally, feet dragging, eyes hollow from too many hours and too little warmth. You told him to rest. He didn't argue. You think he might make it. He's got the makings of someone who can survive this kind of life, which is both a compliment and a curse. You roll your shoulder, stretch out your fingers, feel the ache of everything you've carried. Loaves, debt, cold, thanklessness. Your hands are rougher than you ever imagined they could be. Cracked in places, stained with years of heat and labour. No soft palm left, just grit and grain. They're not beautiful hands, but they've fed hundreds, maybe thousands. That counts for something. There's no customers now, the city's asleep mostly. Even the constables are keeping to the covered corners. A dog barks down the alley half-hearted. A coal cart rattles far off, probably stuck. You listen to it fade. In the stillness you realise just how long it's been since you've really heard quiet. Not the kind that comes when you're exhausted. The kind that arrives, peaceful, settling. In a few hours it'll begin again. The early risers will come knocking, faces pressed to frosty panes. The first batch will need mixing, the fire will need coaxing from its ashes, your back will protest. Your knees will curse you and you'll pretend not to hear either, because that's the job. And the truth is, for all the grime and insults and broken sleep, for every lost farthing and mouldy sack and smashed soul cake, you keep doing it. Not for pride, not even for survival, really. You do it because someone has to. Because every morning somewhere someone is going to wake up hungry. And whether they thank you or not, whether they pay or not, they'll need bread. And it will be there, hot from the oven, crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, baked by hands that no one sees, but hands that never stopped. So if you ever find yourself walking past an old stone bakery, maybe in the damp grey of an English winter morning, pause for a moment. Breathe in. That scent, flour, fire, effort, that's not just food. That's history, that's pain, that's devotion. That's what it meant to be a baker in Victorian England. Now, pull your blankets a little tighter. Let the softness of the pillow cradle your thoughts. Listen to the quiet hum of your world. You made it. Not as a baker, maybe, but through the telling. Through the soot and struggle and burnt bottom buns. You survived something. And tonight you sleep warm, you sleep fed. Sweet dreams, bread maker.